I'm going to call the meeting to order at 6:01. There's an echo.
I think I got it.
Got it? Okay. We have one item to add under board management and governance, item D, an action item to direct the chair to write a response to the MEAEA communication. And I'm uncertain when we get to 3.2, if we have that report or not, because there was a delay. Sarah wasn't able to finish it, so we may just table it when we get to it. Okay. All right, and we're all gonna help the cause here for minutes. We were supposed to have a new minute taker, but we don't see that she's online yet, so we're back to asking Liz. Okay, right now we have time set aside for public comment, and I have a speakers list. I see there's one person signed on the speakers list to speak. We have a short amount of time, so like the 2 minutes, we'll go with that like we have. So the name on the list is Robert Rooker.
Yes.
If you would just come up so it can capture, otherwise nobody on the line can hear you.
Not a problem. Just, my wife had sent an email and we didn't receive any acknowledgement of the receipt. I don't know if that's standard or not. Just a quick question of that. If, is that a standard that there is no receipt or acknowledgement?
No, usually there is. I just have not had a chance to respond
Okay.
individually. So
Okay.
it's just been a really busy week.
Just point of clarification. Thank you. On December 2nd, there was an incident at Bristol Elementary. And our child is in,
Can I
Yes.
just pause for a second?
Yes.
If you're gonna talk about your child, that's fine, but I have to shut off the recording. Because we can't broadcast information about your child.
it's not specific, it's about the incident that our child was affected by. Because of whether it be procedures or whatever happened that day.
My concern is, I'm not sure that we can convey that information.
I
On a
don't think
video.
that I will be breaking any privacy or anything else with my statements.
Well, we have our board counsel online, so if this is a problem, I hope she would tell me.
Can we take a break and discuss it? Because, I mean, there is an answer to the question, but it wouldn't be appropriate for us to talk to, for me to say what I think we should do without full agreement with the board. I know how to approach this. We've talked about this issue before, and I thought it had been resolved, but I guess maybe it hasn't been.
If you wouldn't mind allowing the board a little time to work through.
Okay,
I'm not sure we should be doing this in a public setting,
So you're requesting an executive session.
correct?
Are you making a motion?
I'll make a motion for an executive session so we can discuss this particular issue of, whether or not, a community member can make a presentation at a full board meeting.
A person can talk about their own child. The videoing of it is the problem for me, as I understand it. We have to shut off the cameras is what I've been told, so.
Perhaps it might be better if I interject myself. I don't know if you would like me to, Dawn, if the board would like to hear from me. I don't have a problem discussing this in public session.
Okay, go ahead, Tina.
Would you like me to respond to it? Yeah. So it is a balancing, and I would agree that the camera does need to be off. If the gentleman from your community wants to disclose something about his child, clearly he can disclose that. The board is, however, the meeting minutes should just say that a community member spoke about a concern. It shouldn't identify or who the community member is or their child is. And the recording, I would agree that I think that the recording is stopped, but the community member can talk about their concerns. I guess I would say that I do have the concern about if the community member is going to be talking about somebody else's children. And I would respectfully ask that, just understanding that the same measure of confidentiality that you would want towards your family and your children, that perhaps we don't need to name kids specifically. I don't know if that helps. I don't know if that answers where Brad's concern was as well. It's a bizarre sort of balancing test, I think, from the federal government, where somebody
Yeah, I
can
might just-
stand up and say something, but we have an obligation to not promote it or promulgate that.
Just to complicate it a little further, Dina, turning the camera off takes 2 board members out of it, which means we no longer have a quorum in the room.
No, I'm fine with the cameras being on. I'm just saying don't record. And I think that the meeting minutes.
On but not recording. Okay, thank you. That's
Right, and the
an.
meeting minutes would not identify this gentleman's child. But I think he absolutely has, he has a right to come in, and I would just say, sir, I would ask you to be cognizant of, it is a public forum and how, you know, and just be aware of that.
Yes,
Yeah, that's fine. No, withdraw any kind of motion. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with respect to this issue and not be in a position where someone who wants to make a presentation feels constrained by something, a process that he or she does not understand. So I appreciate Dina's input.
Any other board members? Anyone online? Any board members online? Okay.
So I should stop recording.
Stop recording.
Thanks. Sarah Mangini, resident of Moncton, teacher at Bristol Elementary, co-president of our teachers union. And I will not share identifiable information, but I want the board to be aware that there was another incident at Beeman Elementary yesterday that affected 2 classrooms, resulting in significant property damage. I'm here to let you know about that because I want to make sure you hear. A general statement was made to parents about what happened, but I think it was identified as a clear the halls, but I want to make sure everyone understands it was a 5-hour evacuation that affected at least 1 classroom was out of their room for 5 hours. And then the 2nd grade level, I don't have all the details. I did follow up to ask, was anyone injured, students or staff? And thankfully nobody was injured. But I just want to say again, looking forward to response, and it sounds like that was added to the agenda. That's great. And we cannot normalize this, even if it's just property damage and not injuries to people. This should not be a regular occurrence. What can we look to other school districts to see how they handle students in crisis? How are they bringing the temperature down so that significant property damage doesn't happen? Look forward to hearing more from the board. Thank you.
And I see Brenda Tilburg online.
I'd just like to comment on the last board meeting. I enjoyed hearing what the various principals were doing. I was particularly impressed by what was happening at Robinson. It seemed like they had a problem-solving procedure worked out, where they not only involved the administration, they involved the teachers, and equally important, they seem to involve the students. So I would like to congratulate Robinson on a really excellent report.
Thank you. All right. Anyone else? Okay. Our next item is the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
so moved.
Is that Steve? Okay. I'll second it. Sarah. All right, all those in favor of approving the consent agenda, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. Next item is we have an executive session scheduled, and we have a hard stop at 6:40. Is that our time? I think that's our time. Well, we have a hard stop. So the executive session is under Title I, VSA 5313A3, evaluation of an employee, and Title I, VSA 5313A1A, contracts, specifically the Lincoln exit agreement. We will need Floyd, Patrick, Katrina, and Beth McGeorge to join us. or bits and pieces, but, and both of these, require that we determine that discussing this in public session would put us at a disadvantage first, and then a motion to go in and invite everybody with us.
So you need a motion.
To determine disadvantage.
I
Plus,
so moved that.
all right,
I'll second.
all right. Any discussion? Like Krista maybe wants to tell you why she thinks it's gonna be a disadvantage.
Well, we don't publicly evaluate. It's against our law.
Right, all those in favor of determining that, speaking of these topics in public session would put us at a disadvantage, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, and then we need a motion to go into executive session at 6:16 and invite Patrick, Floyd, Katrina, and Beth. And Dina.
I make that motion.
And Steve second. All right, all those in favor of going into executive session at 6:16, under all our numbers and titles, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, so those of us present will go back to the campfire room, and then the online people, you should have an, I need to send it to Dina, but you should have a link in your email for the executive session.
Now we are, and it says we're recording.
All right, so we'll move along with our agenda. Our next item is a presentation, a report from the Patricia A. Hannaford Career Center Board. And we have,
I'm Tim Williams, I'm this interim superintendent director of the Career Center. So thank you for having me tonight. I think Patrick's going to bring up.
Ready for me to share?
Thank you. And thank you, folks. Tonight I'll be laying out for you our several of our challenges and also share some things that we're really excited about and happy about. So I'll share some good news and some less than good news. First of all, start off with some good news. We have a graduate who is a Emmy nominated person. And those of you who are fans of The Office will probably recognize him as, I can't remember his character's name, but he's a recurring character in the final season of The Office. He's pretty successful in his career, and he got his start at the Career Center. He also,
White Lotus now.
yes, yes. My daughter knows every line in The Office, so she knows exactly who this is, and can probably repeat for you every line the man has ever said on the show. We also have lots of other great things going on at the Career Center. We have our students in the construction technology program are working on a tiny house. You can see it's a trailer on its on wheels. And the Homes First Vermont organization is collaborating with us to build this tiny house that they will make part of their tiny house village once they find some land that they're going to put these homes on somewhere in the Middlebury area. They haven't acquired that land yet, so hence the wheels. We probably put it on wheels anyway, because for us to take students to a job site would take away from too much instructional time. So the wheels, the trailer is the great option. So we're maximizing instructional time that way. The picture you see there is in their construction technology shop. And you notice the thing doesn't have a roof on it at this point in time when this picture was taken, largely because if they put the roof on it right now, they'd never get it out of that bay because the garage door isn't high enough for that. So at this point, shortly after this picture was taken, it was moved over to the bus garage, which has a much higher garage door, and they can put the roof on there and successfully remove the house once it's completed. We also have pre-tech students doing really cool things like building trebuchets from scratch and hoisting items greater distances, and they test their contraptions and figure out ways to more efficiently hurl things in longer distances. They're having a lot of fun with that. We also have a very active FFA chapter. This is a group of students who traveled to Indianapolis for FFA's annual student convention. This group of students was one of 70,000 students at that convention from all over the world. Every state was represented, of course, every state, and all the US territories and some other countries as well. And among those 70,000 students, we had one student who won a silver medal, dairy cattle handling. Very, very successful accomplishment. And the silver medalist from all the students. Another thing I'd like to share about the Hannaford Career Center is that oftentimes career centers aren't viewed as college prep institutions. I'm here to tell you that Hannaford Career Center is a college prep institution. The blue bar represents the percentage of students who go on to post-high school education in one form or another. Could be a trade school, could be a four-year college. And you can see in one year in particular, we had in 2016 had 63% of our students go on to higher ed. There are lots of high schools, traditional high schools in America that can't claim that. So we're very proud of this aspect of the Career Center. It's not often discussed, not often thought about, but we always do very well sending kids to college because Career Center does not have to be the end of your education. For some kids it is, because they can get good careers and good jobs, but for other kids, they want to go on a little further for their education. The blue bar represents Hannaford and the green bar represents all the CTE centers in Vermont. So you can see that Hannaford outpaces all the CTE centers in Vermont annually in sending kids to college. One year they got a little bit close, 2018, but then the gap started to widen again. So here's this chart here. It may be a little difficult to see, but this is a chart produced by the Economic and Labor Department of Labor in Vermont about the careers in growth in those careers in Vermont in the next decade. And the blue bar represents Vermont, the red bar represents the United States, and the career categories are listed there. So you can see that there are some growth industries, some industries that are going to grow a lot. You can see food prep and serving related fields will grow by almost 35%, maybe 33, 34% over that decade. And what I will do next is overlay the programs that the Career Center directly addresses. You can see the top 4 growth areas for labor are directly addressed by programs at the Career Center. And you can see there's some other areas that are addressed by the Career Center as well. And that doesn't mean we don't have students that go into those other non-yellow highlighted areas. They do. We just don't have a program that directly addresses those particular areas, at least not at the moment. So we have a bunch of challenges ahead. One of them is fiscal and budgetary. And the other challenges we're facing are directly related to our comprehensive local needs assessment, which is part of the Perkins application process, which, by the way, is going to get approved today. So we're happy about that.
You might just explain Perkins quickly.
Perkins, yeah, because in traditional schools, Perkins is not a thing. For CTE centers, it's a big thing. It's a funding source provided by the federal government for CTE centers to purchase equipment or start new programs or things like that. So it's an important aspect of what we do for CTE centers. So during the process of the Perkins application, we had to do a comprehensive local needs assessment, and we identified some areas that need to improve. One being staff turnover. Over the years, there's been some heavy staff turnover, which has subsided. And we have some programs that need some work, and we have enrollment that's declining. And we also, or was perceived to be declining, and I'll talk more about that later. We also have same issue that all CTE centers statewide have, and probably nationally, trying to get more non-traditional students enrolled in programs. So for example, we're trying to attract more female students to programs like diesel and auto technology, and more male students at programs like health professions. So we're trying to balance it more, so get more 50-50. And it's going to be a hard thing to do, but we're trying, and all CTE centers are trying to figure out ways to do that. So as I mentioned earlier, enrollment was perceived to be a problem. I'll explain why that perception probably arose. But if you look at this chart, every October and every March is a snapshot of enrollment, and those enrollment numbers are used to determine FTEs, which are full-time equivalents. That's how we measure things for students and for teachers, really, but in this case, it's really important for students. So you can see the trend goes, October is kind of high. March is a little bit lower, like one step back. And then the next October is maybe 2 steps forward, then 1 step back, then 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and so on and so on. Until you get to October of 2019. You can see in that year, we had almost 150 students FTE. And then in March, which is normal, it dipped to 140. And then it didn't hit the new October trend going up. It made a new trend in October of 2020.
I wonder why.
Well, that's right. You don't need to necessarily be a genius to figure that out, but it helps. And you can see that, so we have 4 consecutive things going downward. However, then in March of 21, we see that the number go back up to in October of 21. You can see that we're almost back to where we had been before. So why I point that out, if you see, look at that yellow part, when we did our comprehensive local needs assessment for the Perkins thing, the data for that thing came from that yellow frame.
Oh.
Okay. So therefore there's the perception enrollment decline. And you'd have to draw that conclusion based on that data from that period of time. But as you can see, things are getting back to normal and heading in the right direction. And we'll talk a little bit more about sending partner schools enrollment in a second or two. I'll do it now. So here on the yellow line, you can see the October enrollments for this year and the full-time equivalents. And just to make it a little easier, I'll highlight Mount 8 for us. You can see October, we're at 43.5. And over the period from 2014 to 2022, you hit the high for Mount 8, which we're very happy about. We're delighted that you're sending students to us because it gives them an opportunity to do something significant with their lives after high school. The average during that time span was 33.31 for Mount 8, and the low is 25.25. We hope never get there again, but we'd like to continue this growth pattern for Mount 8 at the Career Center because we have a lot of good things we can offer students. Now, the challenges in the enrollment, that factors into the budget, which factors into the tuition that's partner schools are charged for students attending us. So when we're looking at our budget for the fiscal year 24, right now, we're at $4.755 million budget, which is a $651,000 difference, of like a 16% jump from the current fiscal year. You should all be thinking, what the heck's going on here right now? And there's a good reason for this, and I'll explain that in a second. The biggest reason is our increase in debt service to accommodate repairs to the Career Center that needed to be done. Mechanicals were outdated, asbestos needed to be removed. The stuff you don't really see was falling apart and needed to be fixed and repaired. So that added $682,000 in new debt, the first of which starts this coming year. We still had $120,000 of annual debt from a prior bond issue which we have 4 years left on. So you add those together and the debt service is $802,000 next year's budget, which is a 568% jump, which is immense. Okay. We also have a couple of other things that are going up. Health insurance, Patrick, I'm not sure, what are you guys budgeting about 12.5% right now?
4, I think.
12.4. I know one of our partner schools is doing 12.7. We're doing 12.5 because we haven't gotten final official word yet. So healthcare premiums are going up about 12.5%. That's what we anticipate. We're all anticipating something similar. However, our healthcare increase is only going up 5% because we've done some things in our budget to trim personnel through attrition and which decreases staff FTEs, which decreases the amount of people we have using health insurance, which means we can compensate a little bit for that increase with personnel changes. We also have dental going up a little bit, but that's in the whole scheme of things, that's not a significant amount. Now, here's the interesting part. Because of what we're doing and reshaping staff and personnel through attrition and one retirement, we are replacing the position, but it won't be as expensive of a replacement as the current person in the position. Because you know the way salary discussion works, that kind of thing. We're actually seeing a decrease in salaries center-wide by $3,000. So our salaries are actually going down about 0.13%, which is going to help us deal with the increase in debt service. So we're very careful about personnel because let's face it, personnel is the biggest chunk of everyone's budget. 70 to 75% of the budget is personnel typically. So here's what the current draft of the budget, and we're not done whittling away, but here's where we are at the moment. Current draft of the budget shows salaries at 50%, benefits at 18.6%. So 68%, 69% of the budget is personnel, which is actually kind of low. But you'll notice that debt service is 16.9%, which is way high. So what I'll do is I'll toggle between last year's budget and this year's budget. And you can see, if you look at the gray slice and the blue slice, you can see the big differences there. You can see that because of the debt service, the percent of budget for salaries goes from 58% to 50% because of the increased slice of pie for debt service. So we've done a lot of things to reduce costs where we can, the things we can control. And the debt service is something that we have to contend with because the voters by a 3-1 margin said, yes, you should do this bond and take care of these things, these problems that you're having in the Career Center with mechanical and whatnot. So when you look at what the budget would look like with debt and without, what I'm doing here is in the blue side is the budget as it is in draft 3, and the gray side is what it would be if we did not have that new debt. Okay, just so you can get an idea. So tuition, FTE tuition in 22-23 was 14,586. You can see that's the only number that's the same in both columns, right? The second row. The estimated tuition FTE without the debt would have been 11,773, and with the new debt, 16,295. So you can see that our tuition would actually decline by almost 20% without the new debt. With the new debt, it goes up about 11%. Let's take that a step further and let's factor in money from the state and whatnot. You can see the bolded out row, the total technical center tuition without the new debt would be 22,648. With the new debt, it's 27,170. And as far as a change to the prior year, you can see the announced tuition would go down about 7% if we didn't have the new debt, and goes up about 11.5% with the new debt. Now, it's not to say that the debt was a bad idea. It was a really good idea. It needed to happen. The building needs to continue to function for the next 20, 30, 40 years, at which time they'll have to take out another borrowing to continue to make sure that the building is functional. So some final thoughts. There's more budget revisions to come. We're not done. We're whittling away at draft 4. That could be the last draft. We may end up going to draft 5. Don't know yet. Depends what draft 4 looks like. And another important point to make is the higher our enrollment is, the lower per student tuition rate. Because you take this finite amount of expenses and divided by a greater number of students, the FTE tuition would decline per person. So the 600 is actually trending up a little bit, not a lot, but it is trending up a little bit. And, you know, there aren't too many schools that can say that these days, that their enrollment is trending up. Many are trending in a different level. And at this point, I'm happy to answer questions and take any feedback that you might have.
Can I just clarify the enrollment question? So that is for a future time when the enrollment or the cost per pupil would go down, or is that for actual, like, if suddenly an extra 5 students go there next year, that next year are from? I just
Yeah.
want to clarify your
Good
statement.
question. The estimated FTE for next year is 136.68. That's not official. That's what we believe it will be. But that's going to be fixed when the state determines what that exactly is. It's going to be somewhere around 136. That'll be fixed
Okay,
for next year. So for future years, as enrollment increases, the per FTE tuition will decrease.
okay. So whatever the tuition gets set at based on this budget is what the tuition is per pupil next year, regardless of, it just helps the future to have more
Correct.
students go.
That is correct.
And just to clarify, Tim, that 136,680, that is the anticipated 6-semester average
Correct.
Right,
that is used next year to calculate your cost per pupil.
That's exactly right.
yeah, they set that on an average of the previous 6 semesters.
Yeah, we're not excited about that, the way it's funded that way. It's convoluted. Very few people understand it. I'm new to Vermont CTE, so it was difficult, a strong steep learning curve. It still doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense to me why they do it this way. But that's the world we live in right now.
In particular, in this scenario where 3 of the 6 are part of those 4 in a row declining.
Right.
Allowances for that?
They have not at
Mhm.
this point in time.
But every school is.
give the CPTEs, what did we get? Whole harmless?
Yeah.
Harmless, right?
Yeah,
Interesting.
But that bodes well for future.
it
trending.
does.
Right.
It does. That's absolutely correct. So I just anticipate the 136 number is just going to grow in the coming years, especially if interest keeps increasing the way it has been as of late. So, yeah, we're really happy with you guys as a school district as far as what you're able to send to us and students we get to help find their pathways.
So. Just for everybody's benefit. The voters vote on our budget. And then we charge the partner schools tuition. So. The funding actually comes through our budget. So this directly affects our.
Which is going to follow this presentation. We'll
We'll
put numbers to that.
This will impact your budget.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just wanted people to see how.
Yeah.
Just, you'll see it later when I present the budget. But it makes sense as you're talking about, right? You have to pay for these facilities projects and it comes in the form of tuition. When tuition goes up and we have more students going, we have to send more dollars to cover those expenses. So the delta from the last draft of our budget that you saw and this draft, in light of these draft budgets that have been developed, we added $196,000 to the budget that you saw in November. Among other things, that was one additional expense that we had to build in.
Yeah,
All for a good cause.
The
But that's
numbers
come out
I'm
in the back.
presenting here are worst case scenario. We anticipate it to go down. A little bit. For example, we have 4 years left on our old debt, right? And we have some reserves. And since 4 years is like an end in sight, we can use those reserves to fund that portion of the budget, thereby lowering all the other costs. Because if we use reserves for that purpose, that has a pretty significant impact on tuition. And we're looking for ways to do that because we know that this is a hit. That we're gonna have to experience some pain this one time, but then every year after that, it's not gonna be it's not gonna be a 600% jump in debt service from this point on. It's just this year we're gonna have that. So we'll plan is use reserves for the next 4 years to cover that old debt. Because we don't want to use our savings account to pay for the electric bill. We want to use savings account to pay strategically for things that have an end in sight. And the debt service the 4 years of debt service have an end in sight. So we're looking for ways to do that. So what I'm showing you tonight is a worst case scenario at this point in time. Any other questions?
We can't see anybody online, so if there are board members online who have
They can raise
questions,
your electronic. hand
raise
on
your
that.
electronic hand and we'll be able to tell.
I can see Liz and Kristen on my screen and
Okay,
I don't have their hand up now.
thank you for joining us and being so patient.
Thanks,
No
Wait
problem.
for us to finish.
My pleasure. Yeah, nice to meet you all too. I get it. Completely get it. So, but thank you, folks. If there are any other questions that you guys might have, Patrick can easily get in touch with me. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the meeting.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we move along to update our budget to see another look at our budget? All right,
Yeah, and I think before jumping into the budget, I'm wondering about a discussion around in particular, the bond. Because that informs, I think, some of the context of the budget. So if it's all right with you, Don, if we can
Okay.
kind of work through the discussion items.
does anybody have a problem with that?
And then some of the budget conversation will have that context, because I think there's some
Okay,
thinking to do around this.
so we're gonna skip around, so we're gonna move down to let's start with the discussion on the bond.
Yeah, so,
There's a handout or there was a link.
yeah, I wanted to share some of the context. These are items that we've been sort of forecasting for a little while now. But I wanted to sort of put a little more meat to that ahead of the meeting tonight to kind of get people thinking about it. And the idea around the bond, so if we start with the bond. We've been talking about some of these capital projects that are pretty significant, that are a lot like what Tim was just describing, that they passed a bond for the Career Center in terms of mechanical, et cetera. As we're sort of looking at it, there are some safety, accessibility, kind of green energy sort of updates, upgrades needed in this facility in particular that come with pretty hefty price tags. That if we were to continue to sort of plug away with the 1.2 million or so that we have in our budget right now, essentially all of the funds we have for the next decade or better probably would need to be devoted to a new roof and the new electrical main and things of that nature. And that prevents us from continuing to upgrade learning spaces, both in Mount Abe in particular, which has the greatest square footage, but also any improvements we might make at the elementary schools. So rather than basically consume the next decade of our budgeted money, thinking about a bond that packages some of these big expensive projects together seemed like a good way to go. And as you can see in what I shared with you, we're thinking and these are really rough estimates at this point. We're working to get better numbers on all of these. But looking somewhere in that plus or minus 9.5 million for all of these component parts. And if we did a 20-year bond based on what the current bond rates are, et cetera, we're looking at somewhere close to the $900,000 mark for principal and interest payment. Which makes sense when you look at the amount for the Career Center, what their debt services, et cetera. And I can answer some questions around this, or we can put a pin in that, because I'm going to walk you through the budget presentation that shows some scenarios where if we built that into the budget, or if we didn't build that into the budget, to give you a sense of where we are in building FY24. But maybe there's some questions that are right now that are helpful to further explain this context before we jump into the budget.
The irrigation system, I'm not.
Thanks, that too.
Yeah, I'll let Floyd elaborate. I'll sort of set the table for him, but this is really so we spend a lot of money on irrigation for our fields. When we pay the water bill to the town of Bristol, because the water comes through that system. Meanwhile, we have an abundance of water coming off our roof sometimes in this building that sometimes floods parts of it. So in looking at a new roof and other projects, if we could sort of build into that a way to capture some of that water that's runoff from whether it's parking areas, the roof, wherever it happens to be, catch that and use that for irrigation, and we're not now paying hefty bills to the town of Bristol for irrigation. That seemed like it might be a wise investment in sort of future dollars. I don't know if that, there's more to that.
I would add that the state is requiring us because of our footprint with how much impervious surface we have. We have to create a system that takes water off our parking lots and take care of it. This is the way to take care of it. And in the design that the state had some money for us to be able to use in the design of the impervious surfaces, we included a catchment system design in that. And we find that additional cost isn't, it's a lot of money. Everything's a lot of money, but so is putting water on our fields on top of a gravel pit that we're paying for as it flows 200 feet straight down over the course of a few hours. No, we're not holding a lot of water on the surface. So when we hook up those hoses to try and get some green grass, the bulk of the water we're running is not staying on the surface where we need it. Seems way more advantageous to us to use water that we can collect for free.
What is our water bill about?
Yeah, I was curious what payback. You have sort of worked through that.
Well, it runs around $1,400 a month at this building. I don't know the payback. I haven't worked that
Yeah.
through. It's and it escalates well beyond that when we're at the end of the summer, trying to get fields ready for field hockey, where the grass has to be this short. The last thing in the world I'd want to be is Devin watching his grass turn to bark at the end of August and welcoming his coaches and players back. This is what we've been talking for a long time about an irrigation system, and that is not prohibitive to put in an irrigation. What is prohibitive is what we flow through the irrigation. So this allows us to use water when it rains on our fields, and then water that we caught off the parking lot and off the roof to continue to water the fields.
Does any part of that system address the underlying issue of all the excess runoff, like you were saying?
That's the whole point of it. We have to have a system in place because of the excess water runoff.
I'm
for
saying
the
water
field.
loss, I mean, sorry, because you were saying how it runs through the gravel, right? It just kind of goes away, it doesn't really stay. So
The
is
beauty
it
of
part of it?
Bristol is we're on a gravel pit. There's not
Right.
much we can do about that, with the exception of every year between Devin and Joel, or their facilities guy and our athletic guy, work to how do we increase our organic matter
Right. that's
on
what
the
I'm
top
getting
end.
at.
So did that get at
That's
it?
sort of what I was getting at, yeah, is there a way to build up, is
Yeah.
part of that system building up what's on top of the gravel in order to keep it?
A great one is to spread fertilizer
Mm.
at the very end of the fall sports season, which allows for, and we've done it a couple of times, not in my tenure here. And then there's a plethora of complaints over Thanksgiving break
Mm.
with the aroma of Mount A's fields. But it gets us where we need to be. And we've tried to do it in the last few years with fertilizer, and it just isn't quite the same. So we will continue to chase that.
So I started this conversation, but I think that's plenty of detail for now.
I'm excited.
No, but I mean, at least
It's
now I understand what the issue is. I think obviously there's more discussion to be had about whether
Very
Clear.
Is Mausd the only building that we have to worry about making up for the impermeable space?
We do have the same issue at Bristol because of the parking and space there. And we have a plan to mitigate that as well. Um,
But that's not in.
Not in
that's
this part.
Okay.
and I
Scope
think
of work
Patrick
is
will
considerably
address that
smaller,
later.
right?
Pardon me?
Scope of work is considerably smaller. It's a,
Considerably
Mhm.
smaller.
the system needed is smaller.
Okay.
And that's the type of thing. If we're using a bond to cover some of these projects and we have the 1.2 million still, we can address some of those smaller scale items like that.
To put a water catchment system at Bristol would be far cheaper.
Mhm.
And I would say that playground is at least as hard as a rock as any of the fields over here.
Have you thought, globally, prioritizing any of these things, or some more important than others?
Yeah, I think we could definitely prioritize within this. If the dollar amount we thought sort of politically was more than what the community would be interested in supporting, then we would definitely be able to prioritize some of these things.
One of the things this makes me think about more just for the future is what framework you all use to determine what goes on the list and how to evaluate different options, whether it's through an environmental lens or a accessibility lens or a financial lens or a safety lens. And so I was just thinking more about our conversations about like a finance committee or just that sort of big picture, like how are things chosen and prioritized, not exactly what they are, but what overlays that is the kind of stuff that I think I would like us to know more about. Because for me, that helps me determine, is 9.65 million too high or too low? Well, it helps to know what the rationale is behind what's on the list, to know how to advocate for it. So like, as we're asking these different questions about permeable surfaces and all that, I think that would be great for us to move toward greater understanding of how things get on the list.
And I think if we, and there's some history here, so we all know the history about bonds in MAUSD and former ANSU. If a bond is something the board is interested in moving forward with, which I think makes good sense, just as I thought it made good sense the last two times we voted on a bond, it still makes good sense. We would probably want to think about putting sort of an ad hoc committee together that's focused on that bond and what's in it and how to promote that. Like, there's a process that we'd want to engage in. Even if we think it's a slam dunk bond, I don't think we want to take anything for granted. We need to really do our due diligence, gather input, communicate, etc.
Just one small final thought here. Why now is going to be a question. And currently in the Inflation Reduction Act, they've added funds for nonprofits to be able to access the tax credit of energy efficiency, which hasn't been something we had the ability to access. So that's another piece from a timing standpoint with some of these items. They will allow us to look at getting a reduction in the cost through the opportunities available under that act.
And I would just add to that in terms of the timing. As we've discussed previously, we're on borrowed time with our roof. We're on borrowed time with our main electrical system. These are systems that if our roof fails, we might not be able to educate students in this building. And we don't have the good fortune of Burlington, where you have lots of large spaces where kids might go. I don't know where we're going to put 800 people if we can't use this building.
Right.
So ensuring that we have a building, it's nice to have things look modern and all those things. That's important. It's even more important that we can keep the doors open and continue to educate students here.
Yeah.
And some of these things fall into that category.
Well, nice things are gonna be destroyed by a leaky.
Exactly. Right.
I don't think that most folks in this community would struggle with that concept.
Right.
You know, I think they wouldn't necessarily have struggled with them in the previous bonds, if that's what they would have been narrowed down to.
Right.
So,
And that's part of the thinking was, what are some of the things that really have to get done? And fit into categories that people recognize are greatly needed and are not superfluous in almost anyone's opinion.
I mean, the frustration in the last bond issue was that it was all or none. There
Right.
was no way, the mechanism doesn't provide a way for voters to have a choice, so either,
Right.
it's either.
It's a
9
yes
point-
or a no to that.
No, you can't say, well, here's a choice, you get 9.5 and get this, or 6.5 and you get that.
Right.
That's,
Yeah.
that's the problem.
But that's part of the data collection thing to go through, is figuring out what the.
I think a survey like we did during our community discussions about facilities would be great, you know, which of these particular topics we can get behind. Do an informal survey, or you can go out.
Sarah?
Well, I mean, if everybody just voted and decided that we're committing to this location and this group of towns, then I think everybody kind of needs to get
They need
behind
to step up.
supporting and support this group of towns and this location. That's my thought behind a bond.
We know we're
The
here.
bond is helpful to just saying, okay, well, then this is what, you know, we need to
You voted-
do.
You voted against the merger,
Yeah.
now pay up.
Well, now we gotta take care of it. So, yeah.
Well, but to Steve's point, and building off of your point, Sarah, that there's truth to that, right? So
Right.
now we know.
Yeah.
You
now we
can like
know.
it or not like it, but now we know.
And this is the problem.
And here we go.
have to fix it, and we are the ones fixing it.
And that applies to a top, I want to get to the budget next, because I think there's a relationship between the bond and the budget. But that timing piece applies to central office location as well. We've known for a long time, we're on borrowed time with our central office location as well. We need to figure out a long-term plan. It was really important to know what were the big decisions going to be before we made any decisions around central office. So now we know. And we've got to figure out what the plan is going to be there. So we'll get more into that. But if folks are good for now with a bond, just knowing we're sort of putting a pin in it, I can walk through the budget presentation and you'll see where the bond piece comes back into play.
And the central office piece isn't part of that too, or?
It can be. It's not currently like that's right now, the central office piece is kind of over here. Like we have to figure that out. Maybe it weaves into the bond conversation, maybe it doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me share my screen. So a couple of changes in the assumptions behind some of the figures you're going to see. So nothing really changing in terms of our expectations around healthcare. We thought it might be more just sort of transparent to show the total reduction in equalized pupil. So this is a combination of the drop in equalized pupil that we're expecting. And in addition to that, the effect of the drop of inequalized pupil from Lincoln's withdrawal. Countering that, you can see that we are assuming the revenue increases substantially because we're going to get a lot of tuition dollars from Lincoln now. So those two have a relationship to one another. But we thought it was more fully transparent to say we're calculating our cost per pupil has a new figure, which is this 212 fewer equalized pupils than what we had. So we had last time we shared with you a drop in equalized pupils based on our calculations. Separate from the Lincoln withdrawal. We've since gotten draft figures from the state, which were actually a bit lower than what we had been projecting. So it's even a smaller equalized pupil count that we're dividing by, which has the effect of increasing the cost per pupil. In addition to that factor, which increases the cost per pupil, there's some additional costs that we'll be talking about. We talked about the 200,000 for the career center. we're part of an Addison County consortium for an alternative program for grades 9 through 12. And we're looking at expanding that program for grades 7 and 8. And so there's a cost associated with that. The intent is some students that might be placed out of district elsewhere would come closer to home and be part of this programming. So there may end up being sort of an offsetting savings. It's hard to have great confidence that that's going to happen. So rather than assume that's going to happen, we built in the full cost, which is 200,000. So that if we don't see that offsetting, we're going to be okay. And a couple of more expenses that I'll talk about in a minute, but those are the most significant. We do also in here assume that there's a 6% drop in the CLA. So we know what housing prices are doing right now. We saw about last year's drop in CLA was 4 or 5%.
Almost 5.
Almost 5%. So we're assuming a little bit larger drop in CLA and when we calculate the tax rates here. Hard to know if that's conservative or aggressive, but we're at least trying to account for somewhere in the ballpark of what that impact would be on the tax rate. This huge piece of information, which is driving so much of what the recommendation tonight is, we got a very, very, very favorable yield in the December 1st tax letter from the tax commissioner. Last year, the current year we're in, we had, I would say, a very favorable yield. This is even more favorable than that. So that has a really positive impact on the tax rate. A lot of this is what's creating some opportunities for this board to consider in terms of what it brings forward for a budget, which we'll talk about. And like last time, this assumes all the employees at Lincoln stay with MAUSD, and we go through the seniority list to sort of determine who stays or who goes. And it does assume that we're reducing staffing by the number of FTEs currently assigned to Lincoln. So that we're, with some exceptions in terms of special educator, interventionist coaching, those positions, which are all sort of partial FTEs and positions that we have unfilled need for, we will be able to absorb that. So those are a lot of the assumptions behind these figures that you're seeing tonight's presentation. Just as last time, this has a projected fund balance from last year of 487,000. And the recommendation remains that that goes into the capital reserve, especially since we're going to be talking tonight about pulling a lot of money from the capital reserve to cover the sort of final costs of the lobby and bathroom project. Nothing really has changed here in terms of the figures. A slight bump in enrollment at Beaman. Pretty flat at Bristol and Moncton. Continued decrease at Robinson. And all that kind of trickles its way up to Mount Abe, where we're seeing a relatively steady decline. And again, nothing really has changed in terms of the average class sizes. You can see on the right-hand side, 23, 24, the overall average class size is all within a pretty narrow window. We're still trying to gauge incoming kindergarten at Bristol and see what kindergarten class sizes are looking like there and whether that's a 2 or a 3 kindergarten group for next year. So this could shift a little bit at Bristol. Right now, this reflects what it would be if there were 2. If we go to 3, it drops to about 17 students on average. So it's still within sort of the same range of the other schools.
Patrick, I had a question about
Sure.
the class size for Mountain. Is the 21, so if there's 21 kindergartners, does that mean there'll be 2 kindergarten classes?
So that's part of what we would have to look at 21 in kindergarten. I'm not sure if we would go with 2 kindergartens. That's 10 and 11, which is really quite tiny. And that's one of the struggles we face sometimes in particular in the smaller schools where there's not a lot of sort of wiggle room. When you get numbers that are a little higher than you wish they were, but if you cut them in half, they're way lower than what you feel like maybe is justifiable and affordable. And then you're kind of caught in this place of, do we do a K1 combination, which isn't ideal, but it manages the numbers better. So those are part of the conversation. The expected incoming kindergarten is not 21. That's the average K through 2 class size.
Okay.
Incoming kindergarten at Moncton next year, I think, is anticipated at around 17.
Okay.
Which I think is a pretty decent number to keep as a single class. So class size guidelines, so we look at these in our efforts to try and sort of right size classes and ensure that we're remaining sort of within a striking distance of that optimal average range. I talked before about future work at Mount Aid, really focusing on what might it look like to bring class sizes within this optimal average range at Mount Aid as a way to address the declining enrollment and cost containment. All those things we've been talking about for a while that we made some big decisions on to sort of not access some tools to address. We're going to have to go to different tools now, and this is something we'll lean on to do that. And so here is, I mentioned, so this is a budget that does not include anything for potential bond principal and interest payment. But it does include the 200,000 that we talked about for the Career Center ad. It includes the 200,000 that we talked about for the Addison County Consortium program. In receiving information from principals, there's about a $60,000 increase in need for a kind of a variety of things, from supplies, books, etc. And beyond that, we're having to pay more and more each year into the state teachers' retirement. You probably heard they've had struggles with funding that, making sure that it's whole. So what we are expected to contribute for every new employee is increasing. So we had to add about 40,000 to cover what we expect those increases to be. So all total, there's about $500,000 more in this version than what you saw last time, combined with a decrease in equalized pupil that I talked about. Has the impact. We were at 6.99% in the draft you saw before. This is at 10.26% with those factors. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Oh my gosh, isn't that true? Here's the good news. If we look at the current homestead tax rate, and we look at FY24s, assuming those figures that we just looked at, we're expecting a decrease in the homestead tax rate.
Even at 10%.
Even at 10%, because of the favorable yield, and even assuming a 6% drop in the common level of appraisal. And you can see what that would do to each town's taxes. What that means in dollars is, even at that 10%, 10 plus, it's a $30 to $35 drop per 100,000
Great.
in taxes. And even better, so again, this is about 1/3 of our community pays their property taxes based on the home's value. The other 2/3 pay based on an income sensitized factor. Using the median income, it's a 12% reduction on the median. So I recognize it probably feels like a setup with the add. And oh, by the way, it's really great news from a tax perspective. There's truth to that. The yield is the reason why. That is 100% why you see the drop in the tax rate.
Now, is this a yield that's gonna get adjusted after we vote, as it normally is?
Yes. However, the last yield got adjusted even more positively than what we were working. Whether that's going to happen here, who knows? It depends on what 200 school districts do, or however many districts are in the state.
Well, if we all do what I'm anticipating you're about to do,
then
the yield might not be so great.
that is a conversation Floyd and I have had as well.
And the yield, they don't have the fourth quarter in yet, so they've taken a conservative view on what that projection is going to be. That's typically why you see a better move in May.
So they were conservative.
Because they were conservative in that projection on the fourth quarter revenue generation.
So
So how do we suck up that $30 savings?
here is where we're getting there. One of the things we've been talking about is, so how does that position us against the spending threshold if that ever returns? And so this graph, I think there was a request to see sort of the year over year and projecting out.
Yeah.
This is one mechanism for doing that. And you can see this puts us, the graph, I don't know if that quite shows it. I thought we were going to still be just under Floyd.
We're just over for fiscal year 24 with this, because of the drop in equalized pupil
Right.
for 24.
And then projecting to 25, we kind of rebounded from that a little bit because FY 25 is the first year of the new weighting formula. We've talked for a long time about the weighting study, and that was going to change the various weights and whatnot. We actually experienced a slight bump up. We're thinking, was it 25-ish equalized pupil?
23.
It's not really going to be an equalized pupil count anymore. They're going to shift to a long-term weighted average daily membership. It's a different way to count kids.
Bigger acronym, that's going to help.
Yeah, right. But the net effect for us is we get credit for having more students than we do right now. And so that helps to reduce the cost per pupil, which widens the gap between our spending and the spending threshold if that returns. So FY 24, this would put us a little bit above, but there won't be a spending threshold in FY 24. We know that for sure. So the fact that we rebound and get back under is palatable, I guess.
What's the,
Part of the reason is we've been given information from the state that the spending threshold, because they're still tracking that, they're still making projections and whatnot. An 11% increase. We've seen historically a 2.5% increase.
yeah,
So 11 is pretty huge. And that's
Well-
part of why we can stay under.
Why does the spending threshold drop between 23 and 24?
So because right here, we're looking at our education spending. So the total dollars we can spend. So remember, ed spending is your total expenses less your revenue. That's your ed spending. Our total ed spending is decreasing because we don't have Lincoln anymore. And so the amount we can spend without going over the threshold also decreases because of that. So that's sort of a reset. That's MAUSD without Lincoln, and moving forward from that point
Yeah.
as MAUSD without Lincoln.
this is a silly question. We are currently talking about next year, which is FY 24.
Correct.
Clarification.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. LTW.
So
it's,
Oh, that's the acronym.
I
So-
was like, is that lightweight admin?
Yeah. Me.
That was the long-term weighted.
What?
Oh.
Average daily membership. Got it.
sorry.
So 25 and 26, when you're making those projections, is that basically just level funding?
3%.
3% increase in spending and a 4% increase in the spending threshold.
Okay, and what's our inflation escalation assumption this year?
5.
Okay,
With the areas that we know are gonna carry a higher inflator than that, we plug those in, the healthcare, for example, specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are lines that recognize a greater inflator than 5%, and we've been we haven't gone under 5 on other lines.
So as we were talking about the bond, we thought it would be helpful to say, if for next year, we added 900,000, which we believe at the figures you saw, 9.65 million or whatever, the principal and interest, 900,000 would probably be actually a little over what it would take to cover that. What effect would that have on all of those figures we just walked through? So in this scenario, you can see instead of a 10% and some change increase in the cost per equalized pupil, it puts us at almost 14. Historically, that would be a huge increase in the cost per pupil. Regionally, we're seeing anywhere from 9 to 20% increase in the cost per pupil pretty consistently in our region and beyond. So 14% seems astronomical, given where we've been historically. It's kind of right in the mix of it regionally and statewide
Do we
in the
lose
current
our
context.
$30 Starbucks money then?
So let's take a look at that.
Well, I'm just curious before we do that, the state yield letter, didn't they say that was predicated on an overall 8% increase that they will?
I thought it was closer to 9, but
It was
but yeah.
Let's say 9% would be a more accurate.
And I'm trying to remember if that was on overall spending or on cost per pupil.
That was the overall ed spending.
Right, so we're not at 9% increase in net spending, I don't think, right? So
Yeah.
this is the cost per pupil,
Yeah, usually you provide that that.
right? And I don't have that up there. Floyd, do you mind just
No,
punching that number? You're right, we usually do have that up top, but we don't have it right now.
Because usually we use that to kind of calm people's nerves.
sure.
Right,
That spending is, well,
It'll be way
24 is a
down.
misnomer because we're taking out,
well, that's why, I was just
Oh,
remembering now,
yeah.
we're not comparing apples and apples.
but going forward,
A
it's
new apple.
3.6.
And that's why you also, we have historically shown multiple years prior,
Mhm.
which is what, and then we sort of trend that over time, but it's kind of a reset for us now.
Mhm.
So the cost per pupil is the best apple to apple that we can offer.
Yeah.
And even that's different because
Right.
we have fewer students with the same overhead cost, more overhead costs to divide by, et cetera. So it's a different story, different
Do
area.
you want to speak to the context around the increasing per pupil from a statewide level, what they're looking at there? The conversation, or I can jump that if you'd like.
Yeah, no, I just talked about sort of regionally and statewide, that 14% increase per pupil is sort of right in the mix of where a lot of places
There's
are.
some conversations on the state level from a legislative standpoint to
Oh,
take that
that,
language out of the warning on the
Oh,
ballot, because it doesn't really reflect what's happening.
Yeah.
Our cost and total spending is decreasing, and we're showing this as an increase. And it was a good number when enrollment was increasing or flat. Now with enrollment decreasing, it's a number that is misleading.
And I'll add to that, there was some foreshadowing last legislative session that would be something that would be taken up this session. And there's a lot of advocacy from multiple advocacy groups to have that action taken as like the first action in the session to try and have that enacted for this coming
That would be helpful.
Whether that happens or not, we don't know, but it would definitely be helpful.
Mhm.
It'll help a lot of districts. So far, the difference between the entirety of a bond principal and debt and none of that in here is a difference of 10.25% to 14% increase in the cost per pupil. What that means from a tax rate perspective, even with that 900K, the estimated FY24 homestead tax rate is less than the FY23 estimated homestead tax rate. And then we assume still that 6% CLA reduction, and you can see what that does to the tax rate, but in terms of the dollars, we go from $30 to $35 reduction to $20 increase per 100,000. So again, this is for about a third of our voters. You know, on a $300,000 home, their taxes will go up $60. And that covers the entire cost of a bond at almost 10 million. And doesn't take away from the 1.2 that we have budgeted for the other construction services.
And that also includes the buying into the middle school.
Yeah, the
consortium.
other 500,000 of combined expenses are built into that as well.
Okay,
That's sort of our new baseline.
okay.
And then the add here is the bond principal and interest.
So just to circle back to the bond, that would be something you would also try to get onto, if we decide to do it, the March ballot.
I think the timing of that would have to be driven by the team that comes together to really map that out.
Okay.
My thinking is, in terms of adding money to the budget to cover these projects, the bond is the smart money. I'd rather pay 4% interest on the bond, it's somewhere in that neighborhood, than 9% interest or increase in cost escalation on construction projects or more at times. Or maybe in good times, it's 5 to 7%. This has been historically what we've looked at. So it's still smart money. If we can't get a bond to pass, if we add the 900,000 to our already 1.2 million. And now we have 2.1 million. That's enough to do the roof in one budget season. Otherwise, it's 2 budget seasons of all the money we have to do the roof project.
Right.
So we either the bond passes and we get it all done at once, and that's the smart way to go, or the bond fails and we can get the projects done faster because we have more money to put toward them each year.
So you also want to pre-fund the bond, what you're talking about.
Right, and so I think we have a backup plan, which is we can get these projects done sooner than a decade because we have more money to put to them. Or I think it's a great selling point to the community to say, if you say yes to this bond, we already have the entire cost of the bond built into the budget. Saying yes isn't going to increase your taxes because it's already accounted for.
Because we did it this year, so this
Right.
would be then voting on it for it would start the following year.
Exactly.
How's,
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask, how stable are the bond interest rates? Like, do they fluctuate a lot or?
I don't think they fluctuate a lot, but they are higher than they have been, and I think things are still trending up a little bit, right, Floyd? But they used to be 2.5 or 3 or 4.
Yeah, this bond, I mean, we worked this through the Vermont Bond Bank, and 4.08 for a 20-year bond is the number that we got back, $898,000 a year.
And what we didn't account for that we could going forward, but there's risk to do it now. If the bond passes and we end up with solar panels on the building, we're gonna have a pretty significant offset in energy costs. Because we're producing our own power. If our water bill goes down because we have a water catchment, so there's some things that are gonna offset some of these costs. We didn't build any of those into this budget. We thought it'd be better to see like what materializes before we start thinking about taking advantage of that, but in future budgets, that's something we could look to help offset this.
The last question I had is also related to a bond. A bond makes the timing a little more flexible for like how you bid something out and whatever, like somebody accepts a bid and then if it's in a 1-year budget cycle, it has to be timed almost perfectly to make it occur. And with a bond, you have a little bit more of a gray area to make it happen.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, it is definitely a bit of a balancing act within the general fund.
Right.
To make sure projects get done within that fiscal year. Or sometimes time it so the project starts at the end of one fiscal year and continues into the beginning, and then we can tap into 2 years of those funds. That's how we've been doing a lot of our projects that are in excess of.
Allow the carryover.
Right, and then we have the carryover that we've allowed, and then we have the fund balance that often goes into the capital reserve that we need to access through voter approval.
So this 900,000, if we were gonna put it in the budget, would be initially earmarked to go into the capital reserve, and then we would
We would
vote
put,
it out of there if the bond passed, or,
we would put this into the capital construction line in the budget.
okay.
And so if the
It
bond
would just be
passes,
straight, you
then
would
it goes,
use one way or the other.
then it's just an internal transfer from the capital construction line in our budget to the debt service line. And if it doesn't pass, it stays in capital construction and we use that for capital projects.
Mhm.
So we often talked about if a bond was approved by the voters, that when you go into that calculated, that worksheet from the state, we are still able to pull that bond amount out of the calculation.
So that's
For
what we're
debt
about to get
That
to,
was for the spending threshold. Right.
right?
And I think they already allowed us to pull the construction number out of there. didn't they?
Parts of, and only if you
Yeah.
did the hokey pokey correctly.
Okay,
It's complicated. It's not as clean as if you have debt service.
right.
But that's, I'll skip to this slide. Oh, go back. This is identical to the slide you saw before. Because this assumes we put the 900,000 in and we pass a bond. In which case the 900,000 doesn't count against our spending threshold because it's forgiven. Just as we were talking. So our relationship to the spending threshold, again, should we pass a bond, doesn't change. If we don't pass a bond, different story, and we would have to cross that bridge when we get there. But it does assume that we pass a bond. So I think this is where we were. So again, for 1/3 of taxpayers, their property taxes go up $20 per 100,000, 20 to 25. And for the 2/3 that pay based on income, it's actually still a decrease in the tax rate, again, because of that very, very, very favorable yield.
Okay.
And so, as we said before, it doesn't really change the picture here as long as it's in a bond. And this sort of looks at, again, a different way to look at year over year. This is more from a cost per pupil standpoint than a total ed spending dollars, which is what we were looking at with those other graphs. So this shows the difference, 10.26 to 13.94, sort of the bond, no bond. And then you see a decrease, so that's a big jump from last year, current year. You see a decrease going forward because of that bump up in equalized pupils that we had talked about because of the change to the weighting formula. And then from there, we're kind of right in that 5-ish, 5.25% increase per pupil with those same assumptions, 3% increase in expenditures. And not using any fund balance to offset that.
And using the same current assumptions for decreasing number of pupils. I mean, we'll see the one-time bump in 25, but then our year-to-year comparison, we will start to drop.
Right. And so what this all kind of boils down to, what I would recommend to the board is that you put forth a budget to the voters with an increase of 13.94% in the cost per pupil. So include that bond. I think it positions us really well to address those capital needs that we've talked about. Still a tax reduction for most of our taxpayers based on their income sensitized payment. It's a pretty reasonable rate. I would say that's within what we would consider typical. That might even be better than normal at $20 per 100,000. And again, comparatively, we're looking at 9% increase in Addison Central, 19% in Addison Northwest, and 11% at the Career Center. So our 14 is not an anomaly really when you look at even just our region. If the board wanted to, you could use 350,000 of the ed reserve to apply to this budget. And then it's a 0% tax increase for the folks that pay based on the value of their home. So that $20 increase that we talked about gets zeroed out with the application of 350,000.
What would be the implication of doing something like that?
The implication is not so much on, it has an implication next year because you have sort of found money in terms of a revenue. So it reduces your cost per pupil. The downside is the next year that revenue is gone and you have effectively felt the loss of 350,000 in revenue. So it makes FY25 budget building a little harder as a result.
Well, and I think we were trying to hang on to the ed reserve in the last month to deal with programmatic issues of Mount Aid. And,
yep.
You know, potentially depending on what happens with this SEL study, you know, if there's any, you know, additional staffing or anything that we need to try to pick up, so we don't lose track of that.
So I can have a little bit of an update for you, really fresh. Yesterday and today, we did a lot of scrubbing in ESSER and some of the things. So you saw windows at 1 point whatever million in the bond for Mount Aid. We had a pretty sizable chunk of money from ESSER going toward window replacement here. If it goes into a bond and gets covered that way, that frees up somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think, 120,000 of ESSER funds that we can put toward sustaining some of the positions that we're currently funding. So in the end, with all the scrubbing that we've done and sort of moving some of those funds in different places, we have confidence right now that ESSER funding will be sufficient to sustain all the personnel that we have currently funded with ESSER. So we can sustain that for one more year. That was something we were looking at, maybe needing to tap into the ed reserve fund to sustain. Now we won't have to, not for next year.
But I assume reserve fund, it's not all or nothing. You don't have, I mean, you have to take all of it. You take half of it or something.
Absolutely. Yep.
Aaron?
I just wanted to get into the doomsday a little bit.
All right.
Where my mind goes real quick, so.
Not me this time. Thank you.
So if we say, okay, we're gonna add this 900K to the budget, we're gonna ask for that, but then the bond doesn't pass, so now we have this 900K we gotta account for. That's for the affects the per pupil spending part. Do you have any sort of idea like what that will amount to? And that's gonna be a tax increase, I'm guessing.
Well, I
So
think
two things, yeah.
Go back to Floyd's cryptic remark about the
I know there's a.
Okey-dokey.
Yeah.
I mean, you wouldn't necessarily take a hit that way, would
we wouldn't necessarily take a hit, because we'd still be spending the money on capital improvements. And we would just have to dance with the agency of ed to get projects approved
Before.
and in the right time frame, so that we're able to use them to offset a portion of the per pupil spending. To make that calculation reflect what we can take advantage of.
And just to remember that that only applies to whether we're over or under the spending threshold and avoiding a tax penalty. Even if so you still have to generate the tax revenue to cover the cost per pupil. And that will increase the cost per pupil.
Okay, I just wanted to get my head around that.
And really, whether we're, in terms of the spending threshold, whether we're $1 under the spending threshold or $1 million under the spending threshold, doesn't much matter, just so long as we're under the threshold and we're not paying a tax penalty.
Okay.
Because that has historically been the bar that this board has set to don't exceed the spending threshold, because nobody's gonna have a tolerance for paying a penalty.
One other thing, if you were gonna put this, I mean, I see this list at the top being something in a flyer that would go out for information. Looking at the career center budget, and going back to my earlier statement that it transfers back through and affects our budget. Putting the increase of the career center budget and explaining to it that almost all of that increase, matter of fact, all of it is.
Yeah,
He basically
decrease.
he predicted the decrease, so all of that increase is due to the voters' bond that they already approved. So we're just paying for the bond we approved, is essentially.
Exactly. And really, if we think about that 200K, give or take. If that came off this cost, we'd be looking at pretty darn close to a tax neutral impact, while adding considerable money to cover a lot of things, mostly significant capital projects.
You want to talk about the central office?
Yeah. Let me stop sharing. So again, central office isn't included in here. But I shared in my sort of written update some of the options that we have explored. And they all cost money, you can imagine that. We have over the years and the time that I've been here looked at adding square footage in this building over what we call the new wing that's only 20 years old, which is, it's also known as the middle school wing, on that south side of the building. That was 5 or 6 years ago. That was estimated to be around 1.2 million at the time. I think it's safe to say it'd be at least 1.5 million now to do that. We haven't updated any of those figures for today. We can do all of that, but I thought for the context of this discussion, that was probably not necessary. We also looked at what we used to call the White House. But we didn't like the name, the White House, so we painted it gray, and now we call it the Gray House. But it's
Needs to be dedicated.
it's something. There's actually some really great programming happening there, but it's not a great name. But it's the building on the corner of the parking lot of Mount Apier. So we looked at refurbishing and adding on to that space as a central office. That was 1.1 million 5 years ago, or whatever the time frame was. More recently, we've looked at if we sort of reconfigured the top floor at Beaman. And that was around 1.3. So
1.3, but that didn't factor in what we would have to do for visitors entering and coming through.
right.
The education.
So essentially, all those 3 options that we've explored with architects and looked conceptually, like, could this really work and what are some ballpark estimates? They're gonna be 1.5 to 1.75 million, which is huge money. And I've never successfully prepared myself for the sticker shock that I'm expecting, despite my efforts. Another option is to purchase the building that we're in currently which actually has more square footage than we need for central office. That opens up opportunities for who knows what in the future. In the immediate, we could be sort of landlords of folks that would be renting from us, that would help offset some of that expense. But we could purchase that building at 1.1-ish, 1.2.
We're in that range, you know, we worked with the current owner and it was appraised at 990. We've given it a reasonable inflated figure to get to 1.1, 1.2 today's dollars.
So financially, that makes a great deal of sense. Politically, adding square footage when our buildings are at half capacity is tricky. And then there's the option is to look for a place to rent. There hasn't been a lot of interest in the past to continue renting space. And that was in the context of not knowing how much it costs to actually retrofit space. There's different codes for educational space requirements and office space requirements in terms of load. Steve can probably tell you all about it if you wanted to know. That's part of what drives the cost up. And then you're carving up space differently, which has an impact on the design of your HVAC system. So it just kind of starts to snowball. The perception, I suspect, in the community of thinking about $1.5 million for a central office is it's the ivory tower and it's this gold plated everything, and
Absolutely.
that's not at all what we're talking about here. And I don't know how we change that perception.
So the other thing to consider is currently you're spending about 70,000 a year, right? To lease the space.
A little bit more triple net, that's utilities and rents and everything combined. Yeah.
So divide that into any of these particular figures. Gives you what kind of lifespan? 1.5 divided by 70,000.
I did it the other way. 75 grand over 20 years is 1.5 million.
20.
Yeah, so we can lease this space for the next 20 years and not recoup the cost of making one of these other maneuvers. So it's almost like, can we buy the building and sell it to somebody else?
That's what I.
You know, just flip it, or just see if the current owner will let us stay there until he sells to somebody else, with us getting first dibs on the lease space.
If there's lease space. That's where we just then become subject to, if somebody wants to own it and occupy it. We're out on the street looking for somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the handshakes that you'd have to go through to be best, advantaged to staying where we are under that lease. But
It wouldn't be with the
currently
current.
right now, it's looking like an awful deal, the lease that we're under right now. If we could be there for 20 years and it would be the same as.
Well, the reality is our lease wouldn't be 70,000 20 years from now.
That's true too.
And couple that with, there is revenue to be generated in the rest of the spaces in that building currently.
Mhm.
So it would be a positive, it would be an investment, certainly, of that, well, let's say $1 million to make it easy. And we would be, the property split into threes effectively. So the other two spaces at 50 to 70 grand a piece would be 120 coming in if we release it.
And as you said, we're making the lease inflation proof, basically.
Right. And I think, as Floyd and I have been talking, trying to figure out what makes sense and where our heads are with this. It's, some of it depends on combinations of other things. If this 900K is added to the budget, as we've been talking about potentially doing. Even if a bond passes, we're not making a full principal and interest payment next year on the bond. We'd pay probably a partial interest payment next year, and the first full year we'd make principal and interest payment would be the FY25 budget. So we would have sort of a cash flow opportunity in next year's budget. If the decision was to purchase the building we're in, we could buy it next year with the money we have in the budget before we start making the principal and interest payments on the bond. And then we get ahead of any greater inflationary rate on the building. et cetera. Likewise, we could
Or how
probably use that
where
same
it
money
would
to
go.
apply, directly sort of out of the budget for renovating a space within a school as well, so. But utilizing some of those funds next year to get in front of inflation and manage that before the bond payments start.
You brought this up like probably 2+ years ago, I'm guessing. And to me, potentially, I guess the gray house is an option. I think that you gain a lot more by purchasing the building because you have something you can sell at any point to then maybe pay for doing something else along the way. And it sounds like the rent or the lease or whatever could almost, I get the politics behind a space, but this seems like a business move, not a like other kind of move. And I feel like outfitting a space for the same amount of money, we're not gaining anything. Because if we suddenly decided, oh, good, we're done at New Haven and we're just gonna sell this building for $1, we gained nothing as a district. And where if you put in the money into the building, you actually own something that you can sell. I don't know. That's my,
Tangible
Two.
asset.
it's tangible asset. That's a good way of putting it.
I guess I just think we shouldn't underestimate the optics and the political component. So I don't know what is the right answer right now, but I just want to say that. What makes really good sense in one way is hard to convey sometimes in some climates, and this might be one of them.
Really? I'm assuming the other people in that building are the police department, and you said there was 3 spots. There's another.
Stony Hill Properties, which is Kevin Harper who owns the building. Kevin owns the building with some partners, and Stony Hill Properties currently rents space in that building and has expressed an interest in continuing to rent some space and the police department.
So in theory, the other tenants are fairly stable tenants, or we
Police
don't know
department's
that?
looking to leave.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
Exactly what the timeline is hard to say, but within the next few years, I think they have 4 years left on their current lease.
I think so, and, they're trying to figure out how to fund tying in with the fire station.
Mm.
And how long did it take to build the fire station?
Talking about politics.
Right, yeah.
Oh, God.
And then in terms of Stony Hill Properties, hard to say. They rent space upstairs.
In the backspace, that's all there is.
Oh, right, in the back space.
I think maybe the bakery rents that for it's under 10.
Liz, do you have a question, Liz?
Yeah, I'm confused about that. So people can pay the school district money even though we're a nonprofit, like I'm confused there a little bit. And I was wondering more about, at some point we were talking about Beaman, right, with preschoolers and possibly central office there. I don't know, but.
So the answer is yes, that we can be sort of landlords and have tenants in space that we own. And yes, there was talk at one point of Beaman being central office and pre-K, and that was part of that highly popular reconfiguring conversation we had a couple years ago.
Bailey. Question about the Gray House. What programming is currently happening?
So we have a program there for, and Beth is on and could speak more about it, but it's a program there for a handful of students, 4 or 5, with sort of multiple challenges, physical, cognitive, some of our more sort of low incidence kinds of needs.
So high school age?
High school age, maybe specifically 9-12. I don't know if there are any middle schoolers in that programming there, but again, Beth could elaborate a bit on that programming.
Yeah, it's low incidence disabilities, students with low incidence disabilities. It is grades 9 through 12. We do have a 12th grader there. We have a coordinator. We have service providers coming in and out throughout the week. We have opportunities for students to come in and out of the high school. They eat lunch. They are going to be taking some classes. They are working on job skills. We have 5 students right now at the Gray House.
So, go ahead.
Oh, my thought process on this is just thinking like, if there's programming there that's a bit isolated, would it make more sense to have that programming within this building and have central office be away from students? Because it sounds like there were some complications of community members in and out of whether it's Beaman or Mount Abe or whatever, that we would need to have extra something. But at the Gray House, that wouldn't be an issue if that program was relocated. And if they're already coming back and forth, I wonder if there's a place within these walls to still meet their needs and have access more to peers in the building.
Krista, and then we'll go to Brad.
Yeah, I guess this is why I said before about, well, I guess it builds on what I said before about the sort of political piece and the optical piece. Just, I'm feeling like this is a part of a conversation that needs a little bit more time and maybe a different time or a better time. We have the lease we can extend for yet another year. I mean, I know we keep kicking the can down the road. But if it's going to be part of a bigger conversation, then I don't think it.
It's important to note that the current owners would like to sell the building we're in currently.
And important to know if there's gonna be a construction project, then the need for time there is considerable.
Brad?
Yeah, I like what Bailey just had to say, but I definitely think that moving away from being in a rentals, the leasing situation is probably best, in my view. I think that'd be the way to go. I was wondering, what are other districts doing in this regard in terms of, if they did move a central office into a school, is that a useful way to go? Has it been done well, or is the trend not to do that and be in a separate space?
I would say there's definitely a mix, even just thinking about in our region, what do we see? I think more often than not, central office is not in a school building. So I'm just thinking about locally, as the Northwest is not currently, they're renting a space, but they're looking at moving into a wing in Virgins that's sort of isolated from parts of the other part of the building and creating some security.
All the central offices into one building.
You can move
Or
over
even
to
have like less central, fewer central offices even. So Virgins is currently not in a school, but they're looking at moving into a portion of a school and taking security into consideration. Addison Central is not in a school, and I don't think has any interest in or any plans to move into a school. Career Center is a little different because it's sort of a superintendent director, so it's kind of all in one. Champlain Valley's not in a school.
And they're moving.
Oh, they're moving? I haven't heard. Okay.
But so in some cases, those locations, like, I think they've been in those places for a while, maybe they own them, right?
Right. So Addison Central for sure owns. Yeah.
High school, I think.
They're in the building right in the parking lot. of the
Yeah.
high school?
Yeah.
Yes.
So Mount Mansfield,
When you speak, definitely has their central office in there, and they're like that.
They're complex.
I'm just
Mount Mansfield has, they also reconfigured schools and they closed a small school. And now it's central office and preschool, and they rented space to a preschool and a daycare, which has its own complications, I think, but.
Let's move into the Jerusalem school. You're always looking for some use to that. but
Yes, they are.
I was just wondering what the time frame is to make a decision, and just looking at the interest of
Yeah.
time.
Not today.
Great.
And frankly, the time frame, and that's why I tried to sort of give a sense, like the if the decision is we're gonna refit a space we currently own, it's gonna be a construction project, then that decision has to come sooner than if we're gonna buy the property we're in or look for a space to rent elsewhere. So we probably need to be thinking about the longest window that we need. And so basically we have this coming, so in terms of construction, summer is basically construction season. So we have this summer and one more summer. So we should probably make a decision by the spring. And check me, I'm looking to Steve and Floyd, Steve, because this is your day job. But I'm thinking if we made a decision in the spring.
You know what the lobby's like, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the other
So
side.
like, we need to-
Now, that situation is starting to mitigate some. It's not quite so bad as it was, but it's still nice to be there. Trying to predict when you're gonna get something.
I feel better about that, though, knowing that, I mean, it would be good to tease out some of these things that have been brought up. And I don't think we need years to do that.
Yeah.
But we definitely need more than tonight. So that makes me feel a little bit better, and maybe we can plan for how to pick away at some of that.
What would be helpful, and even this doesn't have to be tonight, but I will want some direction from the board, like. We can't chase everything, like the amount of time and money we'll have to invest to do another study on some of these different spaces, depending on what the interest was to explore. I don't think we want to look at all of them again. So I think we want to narrow down, like, what do we want to look more closely at, and what information do we want to be sure we collect in doing so? That would be helpful to help provide some direction.
Liz has her hands up.
I think I'm just listening, I'm leaning towards renovating a space that we have. Also because I'm wondering, so for the town of Bristol, that's a significant building for us there. And if the school owns it, we don't pay property taxes, correct? So the town,
It has an impact on the grant list for Bristol, for sure.
yeah,
I agree with this. I think I like the idea of renovating a space within, I think that also goes over better with our community climate right now. I think trying to purchase that building or look for another place to rent might be tricky to get people on board with.
And the gray building was once.
Central.
Right. So that is-
Yeah,
Right.
probably
Well-
close to 30 years ago, to more than 20, I bet.
It was more than
Yeah.
20,
Yeah.
because 20 years ago, they were in Lover's Lane. You had to walk between people's clotheslines to go into the office.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
I'd recommend not going back there.
Good job.
But we could put it on an agenda in January or February to try to take action on pursuing one.
Yeah, even narrowing it down, and even
Narrowing
if
it
it's not
down,
one,
yeah.
like one or two, like just kind of narrowing down the
Narrowing one,
options
yeah.
would be really helpful. And then this gives people time to think and talk with others and kind of, yeah, chew on it for a little bit. But if we could come back in our January board meeting and narrow it down, that would be helpful.
That's a big goal, because you know what happens in January. That last meeting is the crunch for the budget. Maybe.
What does the first January meeting look like? I don't know if that's enough time, January.
Yeah, that's pretty close. I don't think that would be enough time. I think there are other plans coming for that as well.
Just one last question, I know we're moving on, but would purchasing a building outside of it require a vote from the town to do so? Question.
I don't think so. I think the board has authority. I don't have authority as superintendent to acquire property or sell property, but the board does.
Okay.
And it depends, it's more of a funding question. Like if we were gonna use capital reserve funds to purchase the building, that requires voter approval to use those funds. If we were gonna use a bond, it would require voter approval to get the bond. If we're gonna use budgeted funds, then that wouldn't need voter approval.
Okay.
That's my understanding.
So then we need to talk about the capital reserve.
Right. And they're all related in ways, aren't they? So essentially, we've known, and I think we've had conversations here, that the amount that we have budgeted in our in the budget, we knew was going to be insufficient to cover the total cost of this project, and we knew we had the capital reserve funds to help supplement what we had budgeted. We haven't really known until the project has gotten now closer to completion exactly what the need would be to draw from those reserve funds to cover the cost of the project. And I tried to sort of walk you through the historical context of this project, where we hired a company to give us a cost estimate, which is typical for us with some of these bigger projects. That cost estimate came in at 1.9 million. With that information, we moved forward to the pre-qualifications, where the project is big enough that we're required to pre-qualify bidders. So we did a pre-qualification process. We had, I think, five, six, seven, I think five companies that engaged in the pre-qualification process. I think in the end, 3 of those 5 indicated that they would be submitting bids. And 2 of those 3 ended up not submitting bids. They ended up getting awarded other bids places and decided they weren't going to have enough resources to be able to take this on. So we ended up with 1 bidder, but that 1 bid came through a competitive bid process because everyone at the time when they were putting their bids together believed they were competing against others. So we felt like we had a reliable bid, even though it was only 1 and not more, which is what we would have hoped for. That came in at 2.7 million. And we were confident, even though it was higher, obviously, than the 1.9, that between budgeted funds and reserve funds, that was a project we could still do. And we recognized the project's not going to get cheaper anytime soon. So it was still wise, if we're going to do this project, it's wise to do it now rather than do it later. It's only going to cost more in the future. All said and done, that 2.73 really has grown to closer to $3 million. As you start tearing walls apart and opening floors and making some of those final decisions. So that's where we sit to kind of make this whole. If we drew 1.7 million of the 1.8 million that's in the ed reserve, then
Ed reserve?
the capital reserve, sorry, the capital reserve completes this project, which does bring that down to about 100,000 left in that reserve account. But if you remember from the budget presentation, we're looking at putting almost $500,000 in again next year, so that would pretty quickly be back up around 600,000.
No, we don't have debt from it.
And we don't have any debt.
Otherwise, what do we have to do?
The alternative would be like, so we don't have the option to not pay.
Right.
So the alternative would be we spend money that likely has us deficit spend this year.
Yeah.
And then we have to take whatever we overspent this year and put it in and account for it in the next budget cycle.
We're all doing dishes.
Okay.
I have a question. So did we talk about a budget surplus and putting money somewhere from that surplus into these funds, ed fund and capital reserve fund? And we decided where that's going to go yet.
So my recommendation to the board, so from last year's budget, we had a surplus of about 487,000, which is what we're projecting.
Mhm.
My recommendation is to put that 487,000 into the capital reserve fund next year. So
Because this will drain the capital reserve fund.
right?
Okay.
So this will drain it down to about whatever the 130,000 or so.
Can I ask another question? I don't know much about how all of these things work, and so I guess I'm wondering to go from 1.9 to 2.9, is that typical? I mean, it seems like a big jump, and I'm just wondering, like, should we have, when we got the bid for 2.73, should we have revisited if we wanted to do this big project now? You know, and I didn't know if there were any, I know one of the big motivations was around, I know there were a lot of different things. And I appreciate all of them. I'm grateful for all of them, but one was having the front entrance be more eyes on, like a safety
More
issue,
secure, yeah.
more secure. Were there not any funds that we could apply for to get assistance with around school safety in that respect? So I guess I'm asking a couple different things.
So yes, security was a driving factor in the design of this project and the interest in getting it done sooner rather than later, and the very dated bathrooms that we all have experienced. There's not any grant funds that I'm aware of, other than we do get an annual school safety grant awarded to us, $10,000. So insignificant in terms of what we're the scope of the project that we were talking about. But that's the one thing that comes to mind that we could have applied to this project.
And that gap, 1.9, where we hoped it would be, or where we estimated, and 2.9, where we are now. Are you gulping? So I'm gulping.
I gulp a lot. I've gulped 1,000 times in this lobby project and component parts of it. I gulped earlier this week at the furniture cost. I've gulped a lot. It's interesting. There's what would be typical 5 years ago, and what is common that we're seeing now. When you think about the time between the cost estimate, from that cost estimate, the time it takes to process, are we going to continue to move forward? Then the time it takes for the architect firm to create bid documents, then put that out to, and this is all in the context of COVID and what was happening with prices and things like that. So I don't know what normal is anymore. We have in the past, we've seen before where we've paid a company to give us a cost estimate, and then the actual cost is considerably higher than the cost estimate.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, should we all have paused to say, it's looking like it's gonna be more like 2.73? I don't know.
So I have a similar question. Essentially, when you got the bid for 3, and frankly, even when you got the first estimate at 1.9, you knew you needed money out of the capital reserve to go forward. At what point did you know you were going to need capital reserve?
I would say
Prior to, we had cash flow estimates with using capital reserve from the beginning.
So the issue with the capital reserve is it requires voter approval. So you're committing dollars essentially without voter approval. I may have that wrong, but that's kind of what it's looking like here. And now we actually are being invoiced for expenses that the voters haven't approved.
yeah.
And we're gonna. So we're gonna have to deficit spend. And get their approval, the deficit spend. Right?
I don't think deficit spending requires voter approval. I mean,
Well, we have to include it in the next year's budget, which they'll have to approve. And we'll have
right,
to
exactly.
explain
I mean, it gets accounted for. Yeah, in the end, it's
We
It's
did that with
accounted
the
for.
locker rooms too, right?
I'm just,
no, I don't think it worked out that way with the locker rooms. We didn't have to access the capital reserve.
that came right out of,
Took 2 years.
that came out of it.
Right,
Sure.
that's where,
Balance of 1 million.
right. And even with the money that we're looking at here, there's a combination of funds from 2 different fiscal years contributing to what's going into this. Even so, the 1.24 million that's going to come out of the budget is more than what's in the budget. So that taps into 2 years.
I think the thing that I'm just trying to get my head around, because we have to ask for voter approval, which means we have to explain it, is just sort of how did we get to this point, and should we have been alerted that it was gonna be that high before we went ahead? I mean, that's the part that I'm, like with the lockers, I think it had to be done, right? I mean, it was like a mold issue and, you know, we got to start doing this. And so I just want to be clear how we get support when the size grew to be that size. I understand why, I can appreciate all that.
Right.
But we didn't really know about that till now, I don't think.
Well, and usually when you come back with a real bid of what's essentially, take about double, but a third more
50%, yeah.
third more than what you would expected. You do pause and you usually try to find some way to get back to the original thing, usually by scope reduction. And if that were the case, I mean, this particular topic right here probably points more to having a committee than any other. Just to have kind of direct communication about these kind of decisions with the board and saying, hey, look, do we still think this is a good idea? Do we want to take the lobby out of it, or do we want to take something else out of it, or do we want to just make the public aware that we're going to be asking for this capital reserve hit? It's just the timing of it is, it's almost like, oops, we made a mistake. The mistake got even worse. And now, we're gonna have to ask people to vote for something which is really already a de facto expense. It's not, hey, would you like to spend money on the lobby? It's, you have a new lobby that you're gonna be paying for. And you're gonna be paying for it whether you vote for it through the capital reserve or you vote for it by approving the budget that has the deficit spending made up in it. So it's a little tough to figure out how to make this a little more palatable.
What does deficit spending do to the budget in terms of like taxes or anything like that? Does it change it a lot?
So it depends on some decisions that get made in the budget building process for, in this case, we'd be talking about FY25. And so we haven't deficit spend in the 7 years that I've been here, but I think prior to my time, deficit spending wasn't all that uncommon. There are a lot of little budgets because we were consolidated. But the way it works is, so if you overspend your budget by $100,000, then that's sort of the deficit that you've created. And so that goes on sort of as a, like right out of the gate, you have $100,000 that you have to account for before you've started looking at other expenses and revenues and things like that. So it gets built in that way. So you could either look at it as an added expense of 100,000 or a reduction of revenue by 100,000. Either way, that's the impact that it has on the future budget.
Well, I mean, I don't presume to know much about this, but is the community sense about what the capital reserve fund is supposed to be used for? Does it include things like cost overruns, or is it more for fixing the gym floor when there's a leak?
You know, good question. I think I've always felt that, so the one time that I can think of that we've used the capital reserve fund has been when we needed to replace the gym floor.
Right.
So that was unexpected. I think it's pretty common practice to use capital reserve funds for planned projects. And this is more of a planned project than an emergency unplanned project. And I don't know, I'm not super familiar. I haven't experienced too many times going to capital reserve funds and that process. So I couldn't speak to the process that has been used sort of typically. I don't know what typical would be.
I see kind of both sides, you know, the deficit spending might be more palatable from a kind of political standpoint, but on the other hand, it's gonna end up costing us more to do it that way.
Yeah,
And, you know, and I don't know, I think that a lot of, I mean, the experience over the last 2 years with supply chain and cost increases and inflation. It's not gonna be a shock that there was, that there was an increase in the cost of doing the lobby. I don't think people are gonna say, oh my God, this is, how could this ever have happened?
right. And we haven't necessarily, and I think this is where the politics, you made this point earlier, Krista, about underestimating political impact. At no point in time in this project did we find ourselves at a point where we didn't know if we had the money. The money's been sitting there between the budget and the reserve accounts. So we've never, even when it was 2.7, there wasn't a question of, do we have 2.7? Process is important, and that's what we're talking about now. But I think that's part of what sort of buoyed our ability to feel confident moving forward that we had it.
Well, unfortunately, according to the way we built the capital reserve, you don't really have it until you have it, which is when the voters approve you using it. So I could see you banking on it, certainly would seem reasonable. I don't necessarily see if the process were followed informationally and we asked them for the money, say last budget cycle, to spend the money on the project ahead of incurring the you know, the financial term encumbrance, that they would have said no. And I would think they more than likely would have said okay.
Yeah.
That's the head scratcher. So we've actually incurred the expense and we haven't yet asked them for the approval.
And part of the challenge and the timing that gets tricky with that is, I don't know what confidence we would have had in terms of the amount, the dollar amount we would have been requesting 10 months ago or whatever.
That's
the time frame would
the
have been.
tricky thing. And what that also speaks to, once you got the bid in, if the voters had only approved you using the 1.9.
Right.
Well, that's what happens when you approve a bond and after the design goes out and the bids come in and the bond isn't enough,
Right.
the scope gets modified.
Yeah.
What months did we know the total?
April. I remember early April, I think was the bid opening.
Yeah, and we would have had to have warned it back in January. When we warned the budget originally to put it on the ballot,
Which we didn't know then.
which we might have known the 1.9, but not the 2.73.
So when,
Or call a special meeting, which is
right,
tricky
Right.
too.
Yeah,
so can voting only happen on these things March, November?
No.
No.
no,
Special.
you can call a special. meeting.
Well, it's
District
a
meeting.
special meeting. It was voted on the floor. It's not even a ballot item. It's voted on the floor. And typically what happens is if you get 20 people, you're lucky
Mhm.
and they make the decision. So.
But we did vote school stuff through Australian the last couple of times, right? It wasn't on the floor.
Because it had to be because of COVID.
COVID. But
Right.
it's gone back now to,
So
We would want to take a look prior to unification. The Mount Abe board. Had a special meeting with a vote from the floor to spend the 300,000 or whatever it was to fix the gym floor.
Yep.
And there were 15 or 20 people that came.
mhm.
So that's historically what we've seen. I would have to look, as a unified district, there's some language in our articles of agreement that speak to voting by Australian ballot.
Mhm.
And so we could still have a special meeting. But whether it's by the floor or Australian ballot, we'd have to get.
if you're gonna have a ballot, you'll have to have an informational meeting anyway.
Right.
So. we need this money like tomorrow or?
It's only a discussion
No,
item,
no.
so.
Anytime this fiscal year,
Before June, it's a valid question.
Before June.
but it's not, so it's not a cash flow concern. Like, we have enough cash flow to cover the bills that are coming in. It's really more sort of an accounting, like by fiscal year end. To make things right.
Right.
We would need to do. So there's time.
If you do it after, well, like July 1, then you get a nasty little note on your audit that says. You went outside your budget year, and you have, you know. You have a special declaration. There's especially,
Yeah, so-
they give, you- it's like a demerit.
Either
get a
way,
demerit.
though, if we're trying to get voter approval. For the capital reserve, there's some groundwork we gotta do to. Do that.
Yep.
And 6 months isn't really that long. To do all that.
Yeah,
Well, I think this is actually asking for a recommendation to put it on this ballot in March, right?
Not necessarily. That could work from a timing perspective.
Well, I
But it
mean,
doesn't have
we're
to be.
asking them to add money to the capital reserve and at the same time withdraw it.
Yep.
Might as well do both at the same time.
I think we, go ahead.
No, you were up.
I think, you know, I think we should just go forward and do what we have to do to get the money out of the capital reserve. And if that fails, then we'll have to take the heat on next year's budget.
I don't think we have much choice.
Right.
I feel the same way. I actually feel like people don't really read that much into what's on the capital reserve funds. I might be
There's one
naive,
group that-
but I've never heard of anybody saying that to me, so
Might not talk to this.
we don't. I don't think. But if I don't hear that on the word on the street, I guess
I think a lot of people are very excited about having that.
yeah, I think it's gonna
I
be.
mean, there are a couple of the anti-merger people who said, you know, why would we merger when we're
Yeah, I mean,
always
there's
spending
always
money on the
differences
lobby.
of opinions on this sort of thing, but
It's gonna be really good for morale. and
I think
image
so. I think
When it's, I
I
can't
think,
wait
I
till it
think moving
opens.
forward, it would be better to have a little bit more advance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like what I think I'm looking for, what I would have liked is more of a reminder of, it's gonna cost more than we thought, but here's why it's still a really good thing. You know, because then that helps when we get to this.
Right.
That's the piece that I'm less concerned about getting this to pass. It's more just, I mean, I'm psyched. We have, you know, gender neutral bath. I mean, it's going to be really lovely. But we need to be able to sort of be reminded of that so we can remind folks when they're like, why is it taking so long? And why is it gonna cost 3 million or 2, you know, that sort of stuff that I think that helps us be the messengers of the importance of this.
And even if we'd asked them for the 1.9 earlier and it went over that, and they said yes for the 1.9, it'd obviously make it easier to ask them for the overrun than to ask them for the very first time. You want to fund this project?
All right, so it sounds like this will be back.
Thanks, Stu.
Yep. All right.
We
But it'd
skipped
probably
update. That,
So January, just thinking about timing, so January is when the budget gets finalized and all the warnings are adopted and whatnot. So we'll just, and January is the next time we're scheduled to talk about the budget and see an update. And so if we're looking at having something on the ballot around the capital reserve fund, we'd need to do, the timing is the same for the warning for that as well. So that will require a decision at the January meeting. If folks feel like that's a reasonable timeline. Otherwise, we'd be looking at a special meeting.
So out of this whole discussion, do you need something from us? We weren't supposed to act on this, but
No, the action will be, and then this was assuming the board supported an article that warned a vote on withdrawing funds from the capital reserve. So that's the action that will be needed, is adopting warning that requests the voters to do so.
Right, I guess
Which
I'm
is
sort of
illegal.
crawling back up the tree here for a bit, everything that's under this, other than Tim's presentation.
Right, so the capital reserve, I think we just talked about what the future action will need to be on that. Central office location, we talked about a future conversation that narrows our focus. Bond will, like that decision of do we build in the bond payment or not into FY 24 is part of finalizing the budget process. So you have two versions right now. My plan is, unless you direct me otherwise, is to bring you back those same two versions updated with whatever happens in the next month. For you to kind of weigh. I gave you those
There has to be
two
an action at that point to go in.
to adopt the budget, exactly, and then that figure gets put in the warning, et cetera. And I gave you the sort of all or nothing from the bond. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. I just sort of gave you the bookends for you to understand the impact. And then. Yeah, then the budget.
So one thing I want to point out, you're also supposed to have talked about the financial report.
No, we're not done yet.
Well, the one that's linked in here is not the one that gets sent later.
Right, because
Right.
once the agenda goes out, you can't change the links.
Oh, yeah.
So it has to be linked in the minutes. So it will be any new documents that came under separate cover get linked in the minutes because we can't change that original agenda.
All right.
So,
Got it.
so you all should have a updated version, or content was the same, but the formatting was different on the
The
financial.
only real
report.
change was what we
So-
were talking about.
Right.
previous
Now
meeting.
we're moving
Jamie and
on
I had worked through it. and
To the
that's the
financial
bottom line.
report. Are there any questions, comments about the financial report? The one you received under separate cover, not the one that was attached to the agenda.
And as I was just talking about with Floyd, the only difference between the two is the bottom of the first page. So that separated out the fund balance that we were just talking about in the budget presentation. Instead of having it lumped together under a line item that was a bit confusing, it's now separated at the top. So you see the 487, 226 at the top of that bottom paragraph. First page. That was what was left over from last year.
Got it.
Any other questions or comments about the financial? All right. Do you need 5 minutes break? For anything? All right. Keep rolling. Okay, now moving down to board management and governance. So the first action, I'm a little confused, Sarah, because I saw your email, but I'm looking at this and.
What email?
3.2.
I haven't done mine yet.
Were you 3.2?
Yeah, I'm 3.4.
Yeah, I'm very sorry.
Okay.
I am late.
No, so we're gonna just, rather than, we're gonna,
I
don't
just-
be sorry.
I'm
It's-
just owning up to it.
We're
and
gonna table this
merit.
till,
Yeah.
till,
We'll take out back in the woodshed.
Weren't there three though that were up?
Yeah.
Kevin,
Yeah.
me and Krista?
yep. And,
Okay.
and Kevin's not finished either, so we didn't even, I had it pulled completely off because he notified me before the agenda went out, so I was able to pull. it
Oh,
off.
I'm sorry. I'm reading this from Jennifer now.
Oh.
Do you have your monitoring report?
Okay, so we had to accept the monetary report for 3.2, but I'll take a motion to table that, and we'll get it in at the first available meeting we can.
So moved.
Yes,
All right,
January is better.
okay.
I'll second.
Sorry.
All right.
Under the Christmas.
All those in favor of
It's
tabling
anyone's own right. It's the
the
first thing on my
3.2
list.
monitoring report, please say aye.
Aye.
So it's 3.2.
Yes. Any
Okay.
opposed? Any abstentions? All right. Next is to accept the monitoring report for 3.4. That one was included in your packet. So Is there a motion to accept the monitoring report for 3.4 superintendent performance?
I move to accept
Yes,
my own-
you-
I'm moving to accept my own report.
All right, I'm waiting. Bailey's go
Sorry.
second.
I didn't know.
Yeah, you did. All right. Any comments? I didn't get any worksheets, so. All right, don't all talk at once. Okay. Based on the information provided, does the board find that the interpretation is reasonable? Yes or no? Yes. All right. Does the data demonstrate the accomplishment of this interpretation? Yes or no? Feel free online, give me your thumbs up.
Oh,
All right, all right. Okay, all those in favor of accepting the monitoring report for 3.4 superintendent performance, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions?
I'm gonna abstain. Mainly
Motion
because-
passed.
mainly because I didn't choose to read it, and there's a lot in here.
Feeling a little bit guilty.
All right. Good. We have an update from the Community Engagement Committee.
Yeah, you got an email from Jennifer with that. It's not on the agenda because it just came today, so it'll be linked in the minutes. Stay tuned and let me know if you have any questions.
All right. Any questions for her? All right. The last item was an added item at the beginning of the meeting to direct the chair to write a response to MAEA. What say you? Krista?
So I wanted to suggest that instead of directing, that we table the action to direct our chair to respond directly, and instead issue a statement that I drafted and would welcome feedback.
Okay, so Krista is making a motion to table the action item and instead prepare or give a statement now. Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second it.
All right.
I'm wondering if the action should be for you to table it
Yeah.
and read the whole thing. And then we can agree on whether we want to approve it.
Sure.
Well, now as part of her suggestion, she can read it now.
Yeah,
We had a
I'm gonna
motion.
read what I have and get feedback.
Yes.
Before the vote.
So I'm saying instead of having
Before
Don,
the vote, right.
right,
All right.
and Don do something after,
Not that I'm disagreeing with this approach, I'm just trying to get the
yeah,
sequence correct.
totally.
Oh, Liz?
I'm confused for the minutes because we added it, but then we're taking it off. So what if we just didn't add it in the first place, right? Like, because it's not on the minutes at all right now. So what if we just made a statement?
Clerical error.
Yeah,
Sort of took some action at the beginning, so we'll just put it there and then the motion will be to table and Krista's suggestion to make a statement now.
wonderful. And then Krista can send me that statement so I have it word for word. That would be awesome. Thank you.
First, I'm gonna read it and see if we
Right.
all agree. Okay. So this is what I drafted. The board and the administration share the interest of our Teachers Association in seeing the evaluation of our safety and support systems being as successful as possible. We have an agreement to meet 3 times a year with teachers and staff around a mutually agreed upon topic, with one scheduled to come up in January. We would like to take the opportunity to use this time to meet in executive session with administration and representatives from the association to talk about ways we can move this evaluation forward so that we're able to get the information we need to identify strengths and areas for improvement in the ways we support all students in our district. Our board chair and vice chair will reach out to association leaders to discuss this after the new year.
Battery's low.
Oh, somebody's battery's low. Comment, questions, feedback? To Krista's suggestion? Liz has her thumbs up.
I like it.
Anyone else? So all those in favor of tabling the action we added at the beginning of the meeting and this being our statement out to MEAEA, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right.
So Don, do you want to forward this to
I can.
the association
Yeah, if you're-
and I can send it to you.
And
I think it's
Don't forget to
Liz.
send
And I'll
to
copy
Liz.
Liz for the
Yep.
minutes.
Okay. All right. So that moves us down to public comment. There's nobody left in the room with us. Is there any public comment online? If you raise your digital hand, we'll call on you. All right. Okay. The next item is January meeting prep. So the first meeting in January would have been will be our staff board conversation. And then our second one will be our budget meeting where will be our business meeting where we finalize the budget. At that, by the end of January, we will be at our deadlines, so.
John, was there anything on the work plan for other than the board staff conversation? Just point out.
Well, I know that we've put off 4.1
Right,
and a couple of reports today.
yeah, so those may, I mean,
I think those are good goals for that.
for the
Right.
first
For
meeting,
the first meeting, to add those to the first meeting in addition to the staff comment.
Well, Kevin and I might be in a good spot by then, right? Can't guarantee.
I'm just
you
thinking that
anything.
those might not take up too much
right,
time,
right, right.
That's what I was wondering because
although we can make any of these things.
If
take up
we-
too much time.
we sure can. So. Yeah, maybe as we think about how much time for each piece. we can-
We could put them on the agenda and table them if we
Right,
run
Right,
along with
that's a
the
good
staff
idea.
discussion. and-
Okay,
So currently on the January 10th, we have ownership linkage plan, which came from sort of October and December meetings. Group writing of monitoring report for policy 4.1, which is governance style. Policy
Or the
review of
oversight.
2.6 asset protection. We have 4.3 agenda planning. That was Kevin's for tonight. And now we have
Mine.
3.2.
3.2. Add that to here.
We're not actually group writing that night, we're just.
No,
Or
Right,
yeah,
that changed
yeah,
the last
We're
one.
gonna
I think
add it.
group right
Yeah.
Before that,
well,
but
What's
it
the
may,
date
that
of
may
that
not even
meeting?
be enough time.
The 13th,
if it isn't, and you know,
Let's see what we can
with
get
the a
January
week
13th.
before, let us know, so that then we'll just move it along to another
Well,
space.
what's the date of the budget meeting?
24.
24. Is that the package it is, right?
It will be, because we'll have warnings and all
Where do I find the date?
language on that and the budget itself, and
Also, there's probably a monitoring report or two that
All the time.
do for that meeting or not.
not usually,
So do we want to,
no.
do we maybe just want to check in on January 10th of the monitoring report for 4.1?
Sure. Yeah.
And that doesn't put any pressure on, like, if it's done, great, if it's not, there's more time, but it's just sort of a check-in.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think we can put it on the agenda and again,
Yeah,
if
let's
it's
see
not
what
ready,
we
it's
do.
not ready.
3.2, what was the title of that one again?
Accountability of the superintendent. No.
Don, I'm not sure how this fits in, but I put in that request to resurrect the conversation that we've had over the last couple
Yeah,
of years about
About,
early childhood education.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was supposed to fill out.
I filled one out.
You filled one out?
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, and I mean, I just have not had a chance. The agenda had gone out and I have not. This week has been a crazy week and I have not had.
No, I didn't expect it to be on tonight's agenda, but I'm just trying to, I just,
Extra
you know,
I did see it. I just have not had a chance to respond to the many, many emails that I have in my inbox.
So is there, so if something like that comes in, what happens next?
So we're gonna have to look at it and read through what's there and then
So do we
plan.
do that as a group?
Usually just you and I would, or you and I and Patrick would plan
When to plug it in?
when to put it in.
Gotcha.
After, after we look and say, does it fall under board or chair or superintendent, or where does it fit? So. All right, and did you all get a chance to look at that attempt at a new evaluation form?
I feel like it was not.
Feedback on that?
The second meeting in January is really mostly all budgetary
Yes.
planning. Okay.
Yes.
Why does it say 2021, 2022? Is that what year we're in?
No.
That's 22, 23, my friend.
On the thing I just
25.
pulled up, that's what's at the top. So I just wanted to say,
What is it that you just pulled up?
whatever was linked in my email or in my meeting evaluation. Oh, that's the old one,
Yeah.
board
Oh,
one.
yeah.
Draft new tool. Okay, sorry.
Well, we could put it online. I don't know what people want. There was a request for more information, like,
Right.
to look at the behavior at the meeting, so if that.
And so is the idea, Don, that we would replace, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna ask, so are these used for anything?
So the current one is used when
Just for monitoring?
for monitoring reports, so that the chair, because that's why the questions are so specific to the chair, so that,
Right,
that's how it's used.
okay.
But this would provide, space for a conversation if we're checking a box and we're all on.
Well, I'm just wondering why under chair feedback, we have sort of a Likert scale of things. But for ourselves, we only have, it is pronounced Likert, not Likert. Isn't that funny? Yeah, I learned that.
I thought it was the Lippert.
Listen,
there you
I'm
go.
doing all my dissertation work and I get corrected every single day and everything, so.
Learn something.
Learn something new. But wondering why we don't do that for ourselves as well.
We
If we're
could.
gonna, well, just because it doesn't make much sense to hold, if we're all holding ourselves to a different standard. It doesn't make,
Yeah, well, that's why I've just put something together as a starting place. So.
we can do the statistics on these two. But it's a lot harder if they're all different.
I like the second one.
Second question,
The second evaluation is episode. Not the one we've been using, but
the one with the little squares.
Yeah.
Yes, the new one, the draft.
I may have missed the meeting. Is this going to replace what we do at the end?
Yes,
Oh,
yeah.
Good.
because at the retreat, there was comments made, like it's focused on the chair stuff, and how about some stuff so that we can look at what we're all doing in the meeting?
And would this be in writing or orally?
We could make it like we do the.
Because I find one of the things I find a little frustrating is at the end of the meeting, it's 9:30, 9:45. We all want to get out the door and kind of do that board evaluation, and everybody says, yep, let's go. So that's,
It could be a thing that just comes, it comes to your email time stamped and you fill it out and you do it while you're sitting there. Do we
Or the
like
next-
having the
or the next
discussion
day.
about it?
Well, the discussion is that's part of true evaluation, that you're looking at what you're doing when it's happening. You know, it's easier to address than to come back to the next meeting and say, well, you know.
No, I would want to do it on the spot. I'm just wondering if I would want to do it individually, I guess, is this what you're saying, Brad? Like versus in a
yeah,
conversation?
well, a little bit of both. I just find that, people are tired and I'm not sure how much, I mean, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I'm not sure how much thought I give to it, when, after spending 2.5 or 3 hours talking about those things.
4 hours.
3.5.
To be honest, I mean,
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think that's gonna be a problem with whatever we do here,
right,
Yeah.
right.
so.
I think we start by trying new questions, like by talking and then potentially periodically sending it out for just an individual, like flush the system.
And another way you could do it is one board member at the meeting fills it out based on what they see and then discusses what they see.
The Career Center does
Well, and
that.
it's a lot-
Basically, the chair just picks somebody random out of the group and says, you got policy 4.1 tonight, which is what it actually is. the
Liz hand.
Board evaluation. And that person basically just gives their impression of what happened during the meeting,
Verbally to.
verbally to everybody.
Oh, Yeah.
And that's just recorded in the minutes.
I like that.
Ooh, that's a lot of pressure. I like your hand.
I mean,
Try it as a group first.
you have to pay attention.
You gotta pay attention.
Yeah, Liz?
Yeah, we could even ring it in with the person who's doing the highlights for every meeting. Because I think that this would actually be really useful for my monitoring report delegation to the superintendent. And it might be more meaningful. Because I mean, and that's the only thing about it being in a discussion, is that if it's in a Google form or something like that, then we can go back and we can look at them and use them down the road. And I could pull up all 12 months when I do the monitoring report and see what the different people thought about different things. Because some of these I would say yes for one part of the meeting and maybe no for a different part of the meeting. So it's good to have the time to really think through. And I like the idea of a different member doing it every time.
In this draft, you have two, Don, I might not use the terms always, usually, sometimes, never. I don't think those are the right adjectives for what we're asking.
I think.
Yeah.
On the back.
If we were to use this, I don't think that's what you're asking.
Okay.
Uh,
There are other options. I'll look through the board, the governance coach and see.
you want me to draft?
I'll look through the governance coach.
Changes.
And I mean, we can try it at the next meeting, and if it doesn't work, then you can adjust until we find the piece that works, so. It's again, just a starting place.
Do we like the idea of maybe picking a random person to go through this list, maybe?
Okay.
Like just talk their way through this list.
Yes.
They use it as a outline to report on their.
So we put our names in the hat and Dawn picks it.
There you go.
If there's
Monthly
an online-
lottery.
Oh, there's an online tool. for
Yeah,
that.
there is.
Okay,
There's an app.
there's an app.
Second prize is a trip to Cleveland.
All right. Okay.
So I got
All right.
relatives in Cleveland.
Who's the, lucky one for the board. You gotta go to the agenda. You have the agenda, it's right at the top. It should be highlights assignments. Oh, it didn't get in that agenda.
Golly.
Let me see.
I can do it because I forgot last time.
And
So
you
we
can
were
just
gonna do it,
add
add
to
it.
what you,
Yeah.
perfect.
So it's kind of like a Socratic experience for the listener who then reports back on what everybody has just discussed and then writes about what happened. So you have just one meeting of really focusing on your listening.
Well, you know, it might.
Brad, you're off the hook because you were next in line on the list, so Bailey's bailing you out.
It might be, it might be more fair to the lucky lotto winner to pick them at the beginning of the meeting.
Yes.
So they could have this.
Right.
in front of them.
Yeah,
Oh, no, you need
And
to
also-
know
and
it before the
maybe-
meeting starts.
You know, maybe have some preference for people who are in person as opposed to online. Of course, I don't want to set up an incentive not to come in person. But
Only one
but on the other hand, if you're online, it's not, it's a little, something that's harder to.
Watch.
Did we miss one of Liz's comments? Yeah.
No, she gave a thumbs up.
Oh.
Do we, for the monitoring reports, do we have any concern of like the validity of what we do? Like how? Like how substantial? No, I'm just 9:30. Sorry.
That's a red adjective?
Yes, yeah, right, because if you're doing a survey over and over again. For it to be
change the
valid,
meaning.
you have, if you're changing the reporter each time, then the. Statistically doesn't hold, but do we care?
Well, that's what
about that
happens
now?
for monitoring reports. It's the same thing.
Yeah, but if you have a standardized something and then someone new is doing it every time. Versus as a group, it's standardized because we're doing it all together. We're all giving a group answer. But if someone new is doing it every time on their own,
Well, one of the problems with this is that frankly, you could spend another half hour talking about item number 3 on the first page.
well, that's what I'm
You
saying.
know, as a group to come to a group consensus as to what to say. So,
Maybe we need a box that
That's
says
different than.
different, divided, I don't know, something that it's not like.
Well,
I
then
know,
you can have a neutral response though in the
Yeah.
middle that says, you know.
but we could,
We just spend a lot of time.
the survey monkey minute might not be giving us a lot of information, but it's quick and it's at the end of the meeting. If we're gonna deep dive into each one of these issues at the end of the meeting, could be another half an hour, 45 minutes. That's why if somebody's basically just giving you the impression after listening to the meeting, if they're paying attention from the beginning. It's a snapshot.
If you disagree, you can chime in, right?
You can chime in, certainly, yeah. It's not like we're gonna
I do agree.
not
I'm
allow.
having trouble, I don't think I can sit. Either to do one way or the other way. I'm having a hard time merging the two, but that's just me.
And some of it may be, to what extent is the statistical significance of the results important versus a reaction to a board meeting that prompts conversation and interest in
Let's change.
pursuing growth.
And picking out something that might be egregious.
Right.
You know?
How much are we worried about that versus the conversation?
The scale's gonna tip one way or the other
Right.
on those two things, which.
But
way
I
you want
don't
it to
think
tip.
we can have it both ways.
Right.
No,
Yeah,
Well, maybe we can.
I'd err on the value of the narrative.
well, and again, it's
Where
something we can
say, well, that
adjust. If
meeting
we
that
don't
we-
like- we don't like the way it's working one way, we switch it, do something.
No, really.
Which, well, I just, yeah, maybe I.
Karen will be like, oh.
My brain. I don't know the difference between proactive and.
All right, well, let's-
Your favorite part, who's gonna make the motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Krista.
it was a good motion.
Krista made a motion.
Second.
Sarah, all those in favor of adjourning at 9:38, please say aye. Any
You
opposed?
can even put another number on this.
Any
thing, you could just
abstentions?
Stop talking.
All right. That's way earlier than I thought.
I really.
Yeah.
Actually. But I'm on the hard stuff that someone understand it.
Yes.
We'll see.
I'm the only one.
Did you say that?
Well,
Did?
I did say, like, this is what we're
Cool. I
shooting
have
for, and
You have?
We have all the-
He was laughing at me. I did.
yeah, he gets it.
Seriously.
He gets it.
I
I
haven't
worked
worked
on
on
two people.
anybody.
I worked on 2 people. And it was not my brother.
Do you want these extra? Oh. That would be funny.
Yeah, no.
I can't picture that. All right, I guess I'm gonna put my boots on. Sorry. Have a lovely long weekend. Whatever people have, they got.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Hell, down the seconds.
This is
Should end.
a long one right now.
Maybe someday we'll.
Right?
realize we're-